Title: The HOA booked my backyard for a wedding, so I called the fire department. The moment I pulled into my driveway and saw white folding chairs arranged in perfect rows across my rose garden, I thought I was hallucinating. There were flower arches where my oak tree stood, a DJ booth on my flagstone patio, and at least 60 strangers in cocktail dresses wandering through my private property like they owned the place. Then I saw her, Sandra Whitmore, HOA president, standing at the entrance to my backyard in a mother-of-the-bride gown, directing caterers with a clipboard, pointing her manicured finger at my hydrangea beds like they were furniture she'd rented for the afternoon. She turned, saw me, and gave me a smile so cold it could frost glass. "Oh, Daniel, you're early." She said it like I was the problem, like I had inconvenienced her by arriving at my own home on a Saturday afternoon. I stood there, key still in my hand, watching strangers drink champagne from tables set up where my kids used to play catch. And I made a decision right then and there that Sandra Whitmore would regret every single choice that had led to this moment. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 43 years old, a structural engineer, father of 2, and for the past 7 years I've owned the corner property at 14 Willowmere Drive, the one with the half-acre yard, the wraparound porch, and the stone wall my grandfather helped me build the summer before he passed. My wife, Carmen, and I bought this house when the neighborhood was still affordable, and the HOA was run by a retired school principal named Harold, who sent one newsletter a year and mostly just reminded people not to park on the grass. Those were good years. Quiet years. We'd done everything right, paid our dues on time, kept the lawn edged, repainted the shutters when they asked, even donated to the Neighborhood Beautification Fund 3 years in a row. Our yard was the pride of the block. Carmen's Roses won a local garden club award in 2019. We were exactly the kind of homeowners an HOA should love. Sandra Whitmore moved in 4 years ago. She bought the McMansion at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one with the 3-car garage, and the HOA violation she got waived on her first week because she'd already introduced herself to half the board. Within 6 months she was on the board. Within a year she was president. The first time I really noticed Sandra wasn't at a board meeting. It was at the annual block party, when she cornered our neighbor Mrs. Fujita and spent 20 minutes explaining, very politely, why Mrs. Fujita's wind chimes were technically a noise ordinance concern. Mrs. Fujita had lived on this street for 19 years. Her wind chimes had never bothered anyone. But Sandra had a point to make, and she made it. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Sandra had already started keeping files on every homeowner in the neighborhood. Not just violation reports, personal files. Notes on who worked where, who had guests over frequently, who seemed financially stressed, who she could leverage and who she needed to neutralize. I only found that out much, much later. And by then, everything had already exploded. The HOA board at Willowmere Estates had 5 members. Sandra controlled 3 of them. Tom Brewer was her next-door neighbor and did whatever she said, because she'd helped him fight a fence dispute 2 years ago. Lisa Cho had been recruited by Sandra personally and seemed genuinely convinced Sandra was visionary. The third, Gary Holt, just didn't like conflict. The other 2, Paul and Gwynn and a retired firefighter named Ed Mackey, were the only ones who pushed back. And Sandra had been systematically isolating them for months. I served on the landscaping subcommittee, which meant I attended board meetings 4 times a year and occasionally got emails about mulch. It wasn't glamorous, but I took it seriously because I believed in the community. That belief was about to cost me dearly. The first sign of trouble came in March, 8 months before the wedding catastrophe. Sandra sent out a community-wide email announcing that the HOA was forming a special events beautification committee to help coordinate neighborhood gatherings and maximize the use of private green spaces for community benefit. I read it twice and didn't fully understand what she was proposing. I should have paid closer attention. In April, Sandra called a special board meeting to introduce what she called the Community Space Utilization Policy. The language was dense, 12 pages of it, and it was distributed the night before the meeting. Most board members hadn't had time to read it carefully. The core idea, buried in Section 7, was that the HOA could designate private residential properties as community event venues with proper notice and compensation, if the property met certain size and aesthetic criteria. Ed Mackey flagged it immediately. "Sandra, you can't just commandeer someone's backyard for an HOA party," he said. Leaning forward at the folding table, we all sat around in the rec room. Sandra smiled like a kindergarten teacher dealing with a slow child. "Ed, it's not commandeering. It's a voluntary designation with mutual benefit. No one is forced into anything." She had an answer for everything. She always did. I raised my hand and asked what compensation looked like. Sandra said it would be determined on a case-by-case basis, factoring in HOA fee offsets and community goodwill. I remember thinking that sounded vague enough to mean nothing. I said so. Sandra wrote something on her clipboard and moved on. The policy passed 3-2. Paula and Ed voted no. I wasn't a board member, so I couldn't vote. I went home and told Carmen about it. She said, "That woman is up to something." Carmen is almost always right. May went by without incident. June brought the HOA summer newsletter, which had a small feature on upcoming community events and a sentence that caught my eye. "The Reyes property at 14 Willowmere has been identified as a potential venue for future gatherings owing to its exceptional landscaping and generous lot size." I called Sandra immediately. She told me it was just preliminary language and that nothing had been decided. I asked her to remove it. She said she'd note my concern. It stayed in the newsletter. I went to an attorney friend of mine, Marcus Webb, who practices real estate law. He looked over the community space utilization policy and the HOA bylaws and told me the policy was on shaky legal ground but not impossible to enforce if I'd implicitly consented somewhere. "Did you respond to any emails about it?" he asked. I had. I'd replied with my questions at the April meeting, and Sandra had apparently noted that as participation. Marcus told me to send a formal written objection. I did. Sandra acknowledged it with a form letter. July brought a certified letter. Inside was a single page on HOA letterhead informing me that under the community space utilization policy, my property had been selected as the primary venue for a private community event on the second Saturday of October. The event would run from 2 p.m. to 9 p.m. My HOA fees would be reduced by $200 in exchange. I was given 15 days to object in writing if I wished to explore alternative arrangements. I stared at that letter for a long time. $200 for my entire yard. On a Saturday, Carmen read it over my shoulder and said 3 words very quietly. "Absolutely not, Daniel." I typed up my objection that night, formal, polite, citing the written objection I'd already submitted, referencing the relevant sections of both the policy and the original HOA covenants, and stating clearly that I did not consent to the use of my property for any HOA event. I sent it certified mail. I also emailed it, and I kept every receipt. Sandra's response came 9 days later. It thanked me for my feedback, noted that my concerns had been reviewed by the board, and informed me that after careful consideration, the board had determined that my initial non-response to the April policy vote constituted passive consent under Section 7, subsection C, and that the event would proceed as planned. She had the audacity to include a parking logistics map that designated my driveway as vendor access only. I sat down on the kitchen floor and just breathed for a minute. I called Marcus the same afternoon. He was quiet for a moment when I read him the letter. Then he said, "Daniel, they're bluffing. Passive consent in a real property context is almost never enforceable against a homeowner who has documented objections. But, and this matters, if you don't stop it before the event date, it becomes much harder to undo. He told me our options: injunction, cease and desist, or showing up with documentation and refusing entry. We started drafting. What I didn't know yet was that Sandra wasn't planning just any community event. She was planning her daughter's wedding. Her actual, personal, private wedding reception, catered, DJ, photo booth, the whole production on my property, camouflaged as a community gathering to exploit a policy she had specifically written, pushed through, and manipulated my non-vote to legitimize. I only found that out in August, when Mrs. Fujita mentioned she'd seen Sandra's daughter trying on a wedding dress in Sandra's driveway and overheard the words, "the big yard on the corner." When Mrs. Fujita told me, I went very still. I thanked her, went inside, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote down everything I knew: the policy, the certified letter, the passive consent claim, the newsletter mention. And now this. Sandra was using the HOA she controlled, a policy she had written, and my property she had designated, to host her daughter's private wedding, without my consent, without proper disclosure, and for a fraction of what any venue would cost. This wasn't a community overreach. This was fraud. I didn't confront Sandra. Not yet. That was important. My instinct was to march down the street and tell her exactly what I thought of her. But Marcus had advised me specifically against it. Document everything first, he said. Don't tip her off. She's clearly good at this. Let her commit to the plan fully before you pull the floor out from under it. So I watched. I listened. And I started building my case with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time to be taken seriously. I submitted a public records request to the county for the HOA's 501(c)(4) filings, which had to be disclosed since they claimed nonprofit status for certain event exemptions. What I found was interesting. Sandra had applied for a private event exemption on behalf of the HOA, using my address, citing it as a nonprofit community gathering space. She had filed this 3 weeks before she even sent me the certified letter. She had assumed my compliance before asking for it. In early September, Carmen and I hosted a quiet dinner for Ed Mackey and Paul Ingwin. I laid everything out: the policy, the records request, the wedding evidence, Marcus's legal assessment. Ed, who spent 30 years as a fire captain, leaned back in his chair and said, "She filed your property as an event venue with the county?" I nodded. He set down his fork very deliberately. "Then she needs a certificate of occupancy for that event space. And a fire safety inspection." He looked at me. "I still know people." Paula pulled out her own folder. She'd been tracking Sandra's board conduct for months. The procedural violations, the undisclosed conflicts of interest, the meeting minutes that had been selectively edited. "This has to end," Paula said. "Not just for you. She's done variations of this to 3 other homeowners. She just picked the wrong one this time." I asked what she meant. Paula looked at me with something like relief. "You actually fought back. The others just paid the fine and went quiet." 3 weeks before the event, the caterer's truck pulled up and 2 men began measuring my backyard. They were polite, professional, clearly had no idea there was a dispute. I went outside and asked them who'd hired them. They showed me a contract. The client was listed as Willowmere HOA Events Committee. The event description: outdoor reception, approximates 75 guests. The date matched exactly. I photographed the contract with my phone and went back inside to call Marcus. Marcus filed the cease and desist that afternoon. It went to Sandra, the full board, and the HOA's registered agent. The letter was 12 pages. It outlined the consent issue, the fraudulent county filing, the undisclosed conflict of interest, Sandra's daughter's wedding, and formally demanded that all planning for the October event at my property cease immediately, pending legal review. It also noted that failure to comply would result in injunctive relief being sought in county court. Marcus told me to expect a call within 48 hours. Sandra called in 20 minutes. She didn't yell. That surprised me. Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly warm, and perfectly terrifying. "Daniel," she said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd love to sit down with you and clear this up. I don't want there to be any bad blood between us. We're neighbors." I told her I preferred to communicate through my attorney. She paused. Then, "I hope you understand that certain HOA decisions affect things beyond just this one event. Things like variance approvals, permit sign-offs, inspection scheduling." I recorded that call. It was the moment Sandra Whitmore made her biggest mistake. I played the recording for Marcus the next morning. He listened twice, then said, "That's a threat, Daniel. That's her threatening to retaliate against you using HOA authority if you don't drop the legal action." He was already typing. "I want you to understand, this just changed the nature of what we're dealing with. This is no longer just a property dispute." He filed a supplemental complaint with the State Attorney General's office for HOA abuse of authority before noon. The noose Sandra had been tying was beginning to tighten around her own neck, and she didn't even feel it yet. The next board meeting was on a Tuesday night in late September. I showed up. So did Ed. So did Paula. So did Marcus, sitting quietly in the back row with his briefcase. Sandra looked at us when we walked in and her smile didn't waver, but her grip on her clipboard tightened until her knuckles went white. She called the meeting to order and moved immediately to new business, skipping the standard approval of prior minutes. Ed raised his hand. "Point of order. We need to approve the minutes from the September 3rd session." Sandra said they'd been approved via email. Ed said he never received the email. Neither had Paula. Sandra said it must have been a technical error and moved on. Marcus wrote something in his notepad. Sandra spent 20 minutes presenting what she called an updated community events calendar. My property was still on it, listed as venue A with a notation that the minor legal inquiry had been resolved pending final review. She hadn't resolved anything. She was lying to the board in real time. Tom Brewer nodded along. Lisa Cho took notes. Gary Holt stared at the table. When she finished, I raised my hand and she pretended not to see it for 90 seconds before Paula said, "Sandra, Daniel has his hand up." Sandra sighed like I'd interrupted something important. "Daniel, of course." I stood up. I read from a prepared statement. Marcus had helped me write it. I outlined the timeline, cited the county filing using my address without consent, referenced the undisclosed conflict of interest constituting Sandra's personal financial benefit from a policy she had authored and pushed through, and noted that the threatening phone call had been recorded and submitted to the state AG's office. I watched Gary Holt's face change color. Tom Brewer stopped nodding. Lisa Cho put her pen down. Sandra sat perfectly still with her smile locked in place and her eyes doing something I had never seen them do before. They went flat, like something behind them had switched off. She waited until I finished. Then she said, calmly and clearly, "Thank you, Daniel, for that creative interpretation of events. The board will take your concerns under advisement." Then she moved directly to the next agenda item. She didn't flinch. She didn't concede. She didn't even blink. And right then I understood something critical about Sandra Whitmore. She had never lost a fight in this neighborhood before. And that made her dangerous because people who've never lost don't know when to stop. 2 days after the board meeting, I came home to find a violation notice taped to my front door. It cited unpermitted landscaping modifications, specifically the stone wall along my north property line, the one my grandfather helped me build. The notice demanded its removal within 30 days or a daily fine of $50. I had the building permit for that wall in a folder in my filing cabinet. It had been approved 6 years ago by the county. Sandra knew that wall had a permit. She was sending a message. I framed the violation notice and put it on my office wall next to the building permit. Then I called Marcus. He filed a formal response that afternoon citing the permit number and county approval date, and added a new section to our growing complaint documenting what we now characterized as a pattern of retaliatory enforcement. I felt something shift inside me around this time. Not anger exactly, but a kind of absolute clarity. I was no longer trying to avoid a conflict. I was going to end this. Ed Mackey came by on a Thursday evening with a six-pack and what he called some interesting information. He'd reached out to a former colleague at the county fire marshal's office. The contact had confirmed that my address had been registered as an event venue capable of hosting up to 100 guests. A designation that legally required a fire inspection, an occupancy certificate, and approved egress planning. None of those had been obtained. The event Sandra was planning would be, in the eyes of the county fire code, an illegal gathering at an uninspected venue. Ed set his beer down. I made a call. Inspection scheduled for the morning of the event. I sat back and felt something I hadn't felt in months. The particular satisfaction of watching a trap close. Sandra had filed my property with the county to exploit a nonprofit exemption. By doing so, she had triggered regulatory requirements she had never anticipated and had absolutely not prepared for. The fire inspection wasn't something I'd orchestrated as sabotage. It was the natural, procedurally correct consequence of the filing she'd made. Ed had simply made sure the county knew about the gap. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that comes out of someone else's own paperwork. Carmen didn't want me to wait until the day of the event. She thought we should get an injunction and stop the whole thing cold. Marcus gave us the honest answer. We could probably get a temporary restraining order, but it would take a week minimum to schedule the hearing, and by the time the judge ruled, we'd be within a day or two of the event anyway. Let them set it up, Marcus said quietly. The more committed they are, the worse the fall. Carmen trusted him. She also quietly canceled her plans for that Saturday. She wanted to be home. The week before the event, I noticed small white flags marking my lawn, the kind event planners use for tent staking. Someone had come onto my property without notice and marked it for setup. I photographed every flag and sent the images to Marcus with timestamps. Each one was potential trespass. I left them in place. I didn't pull a single one. I let Sandra believe everything was proceeding according to her plan. On the Thursday before the Saturday event, a florist's van came by. 2 young women unloaded boxes and began asking me where they should store flowers for the venue. I told them, politely and with genuine sympathy, that there had been a misunderstanding and they should call their client to confirm. They called. I don't know what Sandra told them, but they drove away looking confused and came back an hour later with more boxes. I let them leave the boxes at the curb. I did not let them onto my property. Friday evening, Sandra came to my door herself. She was dressed down. Jeans, silk blouse, hair pulled back, and she smiled like we were old friends. Daniel, I think we should talk neighbor to neighbor. No lawyers, no formalities. I told her my attorney had advised me not to discuss the matter directly. She said, "This has gone far enough. My daughter's wedding is tomorrow. Whatever issues you have with me, my daughter is innocent. Do you really want to ruin a young woman's wedding day?" It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in months, and also the first time she'd admitted it was a wedding. I told her I was sorry she found herself in this position. Then I closed the door. I sat with what she'd said for a while that night. Her daughter, Brittany, was 26. I'd seen her a handful of times. She seemed fine, uninvested in neighborhood politics, probably had no idea what her mother had done to arrange this. That bothered me. I didn't want to hurt Brittany. I thought about calling Marcus and telling him to let it go. Then I looked at the framed violation notice on my wall, the one threatening to tear down my grandfather's stone wall. And I thought about the 3 other homeowners Paula said Sandra had steamrolled. And I thought about the $50 a day fine. And I went to bed. I slept well. That surprised me. Saturday morning arrived overcast and cool. Typical October in this part of the Mid-Atlantic. Carmen made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table and watched through the window as the setup crew arrived at 7 a.m. 6 people. 2 white tents. A rental company truck with round tables and chairs. A van with an Arch Rental logo. They had clearly been given the go-ahead. They began setting up without knocking on my door, without ringing the bell, without any acknowledgement that they were on private property that belonged to a man who had objected, in writing multiple times. At 7:45, a county vehicle pulled up. 2 people in official shirts climbed out carrying clipboards and equipment cases. Ed's contact, the fire inspector. On time. Professional. They introduced themselves at my door, Inspector Renee Chavez and her assistant, and explained they were there to conduct the mandated inspection of the registered event venue at this address. I welcomed them warmly. I offered them coffee. They declined professionally and got to work. The setup crew watched the inspectors move through the yard with a kind of confused uncertainty. One of them called someone on his phone. Within 15 minutes, Sandra's car pulled up fast, parked halfway on the curb, and she strode across the lawn toward Inspector Chavez with her clipboard and a smile that could strip paint. "Good morning. I'm Sandra Whitmore, HOA president. Can I help you?" Chavez showed her the inspection order. Sandra's smile held for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it cracked. There must be some mistake," Sandra said. "This isn't a commercial venue. This is a residential property hosting a community gathering." Chavez checked her tablet. "The filing with our office designates this as a non-profit event space with capacity for 100 guests. Ma'am, that classification requires inspection, egress certification, and a temporary occupancy permit. Do you have those documents?" Sandra said she didn't realize they were needed. Chavez wrote something down. "Without them, the event cannot proceed today." Sandra's face went through 5 different expressions in about 2 seconds. I watched from the porch. I did not gloat. I just watched. Sandra turned to look at me. It was a long look. I held it. Then she turned back to Chavez and began her second offensive. The warm, reasonable, slightly wounded tone she used when she needed someone to bend a rule for her. "Inspector, I understand the letter of the regulation, but this is a family event. A wedding. My daughter's wedding." Chavez nodded. "I understand, ma'am, but the filing on record doesn't reflect that. It reflects a public community event. If this were a private family gathering on a personal residence, it wouldn't require this inspection, but it also wouldn't qualify for the nonprofit exemption the HOA claimed." There it was, laid out in plain language. The trap Sandra had built for herself. Sandra pivoted instantly, impressively, with the agility of someone who'd spent years talking her way out of corners. "Then let's reclassify it. Right now. I'll amend the filing. It's a private family event, not a community gathering." Problem solved. Chavez looked up from her tablet. "Ma'am, reclassifying the event retroactively would also void the HOA's authority to hold it on this property under the Community Space Utilization Policy, since that policy only applies to community events, not private family functions." She said it without any particular pleasure. Just clean, factual accuracy. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. The logic had boxed her from every direction, and she finally felt the walls. I walked down from the porch then. Slowly, calmly. Marcus had told me to stay quiet unless directly addressed. I handed Inspector Chavez a folder. Inside was a printed copy of my original objection letter, the certified mail receipt, Sandra's passive consent response, my formal written rejection, and the supplemental complaint filed with the state AG. Chavez looked at it, looked at me, and said, "And you are the property owner?" I said yes. She said, "Were you informed this event would be held here?" I said I had objected multiple times in writing and that documentation was in the folder. She added the folder to her case file. Sandra watched all of this and said nothing for the first time I could ever remember. For a moment, everything on my lawn went still. The setup crew had stopped working entirely and were standing in a cluster near the tent, watching. Sandra stood in the middle of my rose garden, Carmen's prize roses, in her blazer and heels, holding her clipboard against her chest, and I could see her mind working. She was calculating. She always was. The question was whether she had any moves left. She did. It just happened to be the worst possible one. Sandra straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said to Inspector Chavez in a voice pitched to Carrie, "I want to be clear that this inspection was arranged through bad faith, by a hostile homeowner attempting to interfere with a lawful community event, and I intend to file a formal complaint with the county about the circumstances of this inspection." Chavez looked at her steadily. "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. In the meantime, this event cannot proceed without the required certifications. I need to complete my inspection." Sandra looked at me. "This isn't over, Daniel." I said, "I know. I meant it differently than she did." Chavez and her assistant spent 40 minutes inspecting the yard. They measured egress widths, noted the proximity of the tent to the gas meter, checked the electrical setup the DJ had apparently pre-rigged the night before without my knowledge, and documented the lack of portable sanitation facilities required for events over 50 guests. Each deficiency was noted. Each note was another brick in a wall Sandra had built herself. When they finished, Chavez handed Sandra a written notice. The event was not authorized to proceed. She gave me a copy too. I said thank you. She nodded and left. For about 90 seconds, nobody moved. The setup crew looked at their crew chief. The florist's van was parked at the curb. Brittany, Sandra's daughter, had arrived at some point during the inspection. I hadn't noticed her, and she was standing near the garden arch holding a small bouquet of white flowers, wearing a pale blue dress, looking utterly confused. She looked young. She looked like someone who had trusted her mother completely and was only now beginning to wonder if that had been wise. That was the hardest moment. But I had not put her here. Her mother had. Sandra walked to Brittany and spoke quietly. I couldn't hear what she said. Brittany's face changed, first confusion, then something harder to name. She looked across the yard at me. I gave her a small nod. Not apologetic, just acknowledging. She looked away. Then Sandra turned to the crew chief and said loudly and clearly, "Begin setup. We're proceeding." The crew chief looked uncertain. His colleague held up his phone showing the inspector's notice. Sandra said, "I'm telling you to proceed. If there are legal issues, I will handle them." The crew chief hesitated. And that was when Ed Mackey walked around the corner of my house with his phone to his ear. Ed had been parked one street over, waiting. He'd been monitoring the inspection through texts from me. When I texted him, "She's telling them to proceed anyway," he'd made a call. Now he walked across my lawn with the calm authority of a man who spent 3 decades running toward fires, and he said, in a voice that needed no amplification, "Sandra, don't." She turned to look at him. "The fire inspection has been completed and the event has been denied certification. If you proceed, you're not just violating HOA procedure. You're operating an illegal public gathering on private property without the owner's consent. That's criminal trespass, potentially, and it's a fire code violation that can result in this entire setup being condemned. He paused. I've already called it in. Called what in? Sandra said very quietly. Ed didn't answer. He didn't need to, because from 2 blocks east came the sound, low, then louder, of a fire engine. Not racing, just moving deliberately, the way emergency vehicles move when they've been dispatched for a non-emergency compliance check but still show up with full equipment because that's protocol. The truck turned onto Willowmere Drive and rolled toward my house with the slow, implacable weight of bureaucracy in motion, and I watched Sandra Whitmore's face drain of color for the first and only time I had ever seen. The engine stopped at my curb. 2 firefighters climbed down. Not rushing, not alarmed, just doing their job. Ed went to speak with them. The crew chief, watching all of this, made a decision with admirable self-preservation instinct. He told his team to stop. They stopped. One of them quietly began folding up the chair he'd just unfolded. Sandra saw that and spun toward him. Don't you dare. He kept folding. What happened next I have replayed in my mind many times because it is important to understand that I did not plan it, did not request it, and in fact was mildly alarmed by it in the moment. One of the firefighters, going through standard protocol for an event venue compliance check, activated the truck's exterior water test, a brief spray to check pressure and verify hose function, standard procedure per their protocol. The arc of water was not aimed at the yard. It was aimed at the street. But the wind, which had been picking up all morning, caught it. The tent nearest the curb, the reception tent, white linen, rented chairs inside. A center floral piece Carmen later told me must have cost at least $400. Caught the water sideways. Not a direct hit. Just the edge of a pressure test arc carried on an October wind. But it was enough. The tent shifted, pulled at its stakes, and then 2 of the corner stakes, planted in my lawn by a crew that had never been given permission to plant anything, came loose. The tent listed, caught the wind like a sail, and came down across 3 tables and the flower arch Sandra had placed over my garden gate. There was a long moment of silence. Then Sandra made a sound I had never heard from her before. It wasn't a word. It was something involuntary, something that came from somewhere underneath all the control and calculation, something that sounded like a person coming apart at the seams in public for the first time in their adult life. She was staring at the collapsed tent covering her daughter's wedding arch, white linen draped over Carmen's rose garden like a surrender flag. And then she did the thing I had not predicted. She turned to the gathered guests. Maybe 30 people who had arrived early and were standing on the sidewalk watching, and she pointed at me and shouted, "He did this. He arranged all of this to ruin my daughter's wedding." 30 pairs of eyes turned to me. I stood on my porch steps. I was holding a cup of coffee. I had not moved from my porch since the inspectors arrived. Several of the guests had been watching the entire time. Mrs. Fujita, who had been watching from her front porch across the street, later told me that multiple guests had turned to each other and started talking quietly after Sandra's accusation. One of them, a woman in a green dress I didn't recognize, had said clearly enough for several people to hear, "But he lives here. This is his house." Sandra's daughter Brittany stepped forward then. I will always remember this moment. She stepped between her mother and the crowd with her small bouquet still in her hands, and she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "Mom, stop." Sandra turned to look at her. "Brittany, Mom, stop talking." Something passed between them, years of something all compressed into this moment. Sandra went quiet. It was the first time I had ever seen Sandra Whitmore obey anyone. And it was her 26-year-old daughter who did it. The firefighters completed their compliance check and departed. The crew chief, having received no clear authorization to either proceed or fully disassemble, made the professional decision to begin loading equipment back into his truck. Sandra watched this happen. She didn't try to stop them this time. The guests on the sidewalk began drifting away in ones and twos. Someone texted someone else, and phones came out, and I had the dim awareness that what was happening on my front lawn was being documented by people who had come dressed for a wedding and ended up witnessing something considerably more consequential. It came back to my porch. He didn't say anything. He just stood next to me and drank from the coffee mug I'd brought him earlier and watched the dismantling of an afternoon that had taken months to engineer. I thought about what Paula had said, that Sandra had done versions of this to other homeowners who had just gone quiet. I thought about what it would have looked like if I had just gone along. If I'd agreed to the $200 and let them use my yard and smiled at the wedding photos. I thought about my grandfather's stone wall and the violation notice Sandra had taped to my door. I drank my coffee. By noon, my yard was empty. The tent was in pieces on the truck. The chairs were loaded. The florist had retrieved her flowers and driven away without a word. The DJ, who had pre-rigged his equipment the night before without my consent, came and disassembled it apologetically. He clearly had not understood the situation. My rose garden had taken some damage from the tent collapse. 3 bushes were bent. 2 stakes had pierced the soil near the roots of Carmen's award-winning Duchess de Brabant. Carmen walked out, looked at it for a moment, and then went inside to get her gardening gloves. She didn't cry. She just got to work. Sandra was gone. I didn't see her leave. 1 minute she was standing in my yard and then she wasn't, and I had no idea what that meant for what came next. I was relieved, honestly. Not triumphant. Just relieved that it was over, or at least that this phase was over. I had no illusions about Sandra walking quietly into the rest of her life. But for right now, on this Saturday afternoon, my yard was mine again, and the caterers were gone, and Carmen was replanting rose bushes, and Ed was finishing his coffee on my porch. Felt temporarily like peace. What I found out later, much later, through a combination of sources I'll describe, was what happened on Sandra's side of the street that afternoon. Brittany had gone into her mother's house after the collapse. They had a conversation that reportedly lasted over an hour. Sandra's sister, who had driven 4 hours for the wedding, was present. According to what reached me through Paula, who heard it from Mrs. Fujita, who had a certain gift for knowing things, Brittany had known, in the back of her mind, that the venue arrangement was unusual. She hadn't asked too many questions. The morning's events had prompted her to ask all of them at once. One of the questions Brittany reportedly asked was, "Did you actually get permission from the man who lives there?" And Sandra had said what Sandra always said, that she had handled it, that it was a formality, that there were mechanisms in place. And Brittany, who was 26 and not entirely her mother's daughter, had said, "So no, that was the moment, by all accounts, when the real damage was done. Not to the tent, not to the wedding arch, but to something between Sandra and her daughter that would take a long time to repair." I didn't feel good about that, but I had not caused it. Sandra had. That evening, Marcus called me. He'd been monitoring the situation and had received a notification that the State Attorney General's office had flagged our supplemental complaint for review. The threatening phone call recording I'd submitted had apparently triggered a concern-level escalation. "This is moving faster than I expected," he said. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. A kind of professional excitement. The tone of an attorney who realizes the case has become more interesting than anticipated. "What does that mean practically?" I asked. He said, "It means Sandra Whitmore is about to have a very bad few months." Sunday was quiet. We went to church, came home, had lunch. I raked leaves. Carmen worked in the garden. The kids, my son Marco, 17, and my daughter Sophia, 14, had been aware that something big had been happening, but we'd shielded them from most of it. Marco asked me over lunch if we'd won. I thought about it. "I think so," I said. "But it's not really about winning." Marco looked at me with the expression teenagers reserve for when their parents say something they recognize as technically true but contextually unsatisfying. Dad, she tried to hold a wedding in our backyard. I said, yeah, we won. Monday morning, I got an email from the HOA management company, the third-party firm Sandra had hired to handle billing and administrative compliance. It was a routine billing notice. Buried at the bottom, in a standardized footer, was a note that the HOA's nonprofit status had been flagged for review by the county assessor's office pending investigation of event venue registration discrepancies. I read that twice. The county was already looking at it. Ed's contact had apparently done more than just schedule an inspection. Paula called me that afternoon. She had spoken to Gary Holt, the reluctant board member who spent most meetings studying the floor. Gary had called her. He'd apparently seen the video. Yes, there was video. 3 of the wedding guests had filmed significant portions of the morning and someone had posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption "Things went a little sideways at 14 Willowmere today," and it had been shared 47 times before Sandra managed to get it taken down. Gary said he'd had no idea Sandra had planned to use my yard for her daughter's private wedding. He hadn't understood that part. He thought it was a neighborhood barbecue. Gary is having some thoughts, Paula told me. I asked Paula what kind of thoughts. She said, the kind where a man who's been going along to get along realizes he might personally be named in a state complaint if he doesn't distance himself soon. I said that sounded about right. Paula said Gary had asked her what he should do. She told him, vote to rescind the community space utilization policy at the next board meeting and submit a signed statement clarifying that he had not been informed of the personal nature of the planned event. He'd agreed immediately. Tom Brewer is also reconsidering his life choices, Paula added. I thanked her and hung up feeling something I could only describe as forward motion. Sandra did not go quietly. I had not expected her to. 2 days after the failed wedding, she sent a letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood, physical, in envelopes with stamps, claiming that a coordinated effort by a small group of bad faith residents had sabotaged a legitimate community event and caused significant property damage. The property damage she was referring to was the tent. The tent her contractors had set up without consent on my property. The damage caused by a wind gust during a regulatory inspection that her own filing had triggered. I called Marcus. He said, keep it. Every word is useful. The neighborhood letter created more problems for Sandra than it solved. Several homeowners who hadn't been following the story closely read it and started asking questions. Why was the HOA using a private residence for events? Why hadn't residents been told in advance? Who approved it? The questions went to the board email address. Tom Brewer, to his credit or cowardice, probably both, forwarded several of them to Sandra without answering. Sandra's replies were masterpieces of evasive reassurance, but they required her to keep making claims that were increasingly contradicted by the county's public filings. The hole she was digging was getting deeper with every letter she sent. I want to pause here and tell you something about what the months of this conflict had cost me, beyond the obvious. I had spent probably 60 hours on this. Calls with Marcus, document gathering, meetings with Paula and Ed, drafting objections, reviewing filings. I had lost sleep. Carmen and I had argued twice, not about what to do but about how much emotional energy I was spending. My kids had felt the tension even when we tried to hide it. My neighbor 2 houses down, who'd always been friendly, started avoiding eye contact around this time, probably because she didn't know whose side to be on. This was the true cost of what Sandra had done. Not just the property intrusion, but the months of accumulated stress that come from being forced to fight for something that should never have required a fight. In the second week of October, just days after the failed wedding, I received notification from the county that the HOA's nonprofit event venue registration had been revoked pending an audit of the original filing. The grounds cited were misrepresentation of venue authority and absence of documented property owner consent. The revocation also triggered a review of the HOA's overall 501(c)(4) status, which, Marcus explained to me with barely contained satisfaction, meant that every financial exemption the HOA had been claiming for the past 3 years was now potentially subject to reassessment. If the status was revoked retroactively, the HOA could owe back taxes. Sandra had potentially exposed the entire community to liability to gain a free wedding venue for her daughter. Word of the tax liability possibility spread through the neighborhood with the speed and chaos of a rumor in a place where people care intensely about their property values. I got 3 calls in one afternoon from homeowners I barely knew. 2 of them were angry at me for stirring this up. One of them said, "Why couldn't you just let them have their party?" I explained, calmly and without detail, that letting them have their party would have meant accepting that an HOA president could use a policy she wrote to commandeer my property for her daughter's private wedding, while threatening me with HOA violations if I objected. There was a long silence. Then the caller said, "Oh, I didn't know all that. Most people didn't." Sandra had controlled the narrative for a long time. Paula called a special board meeting for the 3rd week of October. She had the authority to do it as a board member, and she did it without running it by Sandra first, which was technically within the rules and practically a declaration of war. The agenda had 2 items: rescission of the community space utilization policy and a review of the HOA president's conduct. Sandra found out about the meeting through Gary Holt, who apparently had the decency to warn her even as he was cooperating with Paula. Sandra sent a counter-email calling the meeting unauthorized and procedurally improper. Marcus reviewed the bylaws and confirmed it was completely proper. The meeting was on. I went. I brought Marcus. Ed and Paula were there. Gary Holt sat in the corner looking like a man who had finally understood what he'd been part of. Tom Brewer did not show up. Lisa Cho showed up, took one look at the room, and sat very quietly in the back. Sandra arrived 5 minutes late, unusual for her, wearing a blazer that was slightly off-center, which on Sandra was the equivalent of anyone else having a visible breakdown. She took her seat at the head of the table. Paula called the meeting to order. Sandra said, "I'm calling this meeting to order." Paula said, "I called it. I have the floor." Sandra said, "This isn't Sandra," Gary Holt said. "Just that. Just her name." But the way he said it stopped her. She sat down. Paula presented the rescission motion first. She drafted it with Marcus's input, and it was airtight. The community space utilization policy was formally declared void on the grounds of procedural irregularity, undisclosed conflict of interest, and misrepresentation in the county filing. Gary voted yes. Lisa Cho, after a pause I will always remember, voted yes. Sandra voted no. The motion passed 3-1 with Tom absent. The policy that Sandra had spent months engineering was erased in about 8 minutes. The conduct review was harder. Sandra was composed, even elegant in her denials. She framed every decision as having been made in good faith for the community's benefit. She characterized the county filing as an administrative error. She denied any knowledge that the recording of her phone threat to me had been submitted to the AG. When Paula presented the timeline, date by date, document by document, Sandra listened with her head slightly tilted, like a person watching a foreign film without subtitles and waiting patiently for it to end. She did not crack, but she didn't need to. The record did the work. At the end of the meeting, Paula moved that Sandra be formally censured by the board for conduct unbecoming an HOA officer, specifically the undisclosed personal conflict of interest in utilizing association policies for private benefit. Gary voted yes. Lisa, after another pause, voted yes. Sandra voted no. The censure passed. Sandra said very quietly that she intended to contest it. Paula said that was her right. Sandra gathered her things, stood up, buttoned her blazer, and walked out without looking at anyone. Lisa Cho watched her go and then put her head in her hands and sat very still for a moment. Gary stared at the table. Ed said, "Well," and that was the board meeting. 3 days later, Sandra Whitmore resigned as HOA president. The letter she submitted was one paragraph. It cited personal reasons and the increasingly hostile environment created by certain residents. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge any wrongdoing. She did not mention my name. I read the resignation letter that Paula forwarded to me, and I sat with it for a while. It wasn't satisfying in the way I'd imagined it might be. The vindication I'd expected felt quieter than I'd thought. Mostly I just felt tired. The way you feel after a long illness finally passes and you realize how much energy you've been spending just holding on. The HOA held elections in November. Paula ran for president. Ed ran for the open board seat. Both won. I was asked to join the landscaping committee again. I said yes. The first thing the new board did was hold a proper review of all outstanding fines and violation notices. My stone wall violation was the first one rescinded. Paula read it out at the meeting and then looked at me and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sandra's daughter Brittany called me in early November. I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number. She apologized for what had happened. She said she was sorry her mother had put me in that position. I told her it wasn't her fault. She said, "I know, but I still wanted to say it." I thanked her. I asked if she was doing okay. She said she was going to be fine. She said she and her fiancé had rescheduled the wedding for February, at an actual venue, one they'd paid for themselves. I told her I hoped it was beautiful. I meant it. She said thank you. She paused, then said, "She really believed she was doing the right thing, you know? That makes it both better and worse." I said I understood that. I did. The state AG's office completed its preliminary review in early December. They sent me a notification, not detailed, just a form letter, confirming that the complaint had been substantiated and referred for further inquiry. Marcus explained that this likely meant a formal investigation into HOA abuse of authority and potentially the fraudulent county filing. It would take time. It might result in fines. It might not go further than that. But it was on the record, officially, that Sandra Whitmore had abused her position as HOA president for personal benefit. That was something. Carmen's roses mostly recovered. 2 of the 3 bent bushes came back in the spring. The third one, a rare pale pink climber she'd had for 9 years, did not. We planted a new one. Carmen chose a variety called New Dawn, which felt appropriate. It wasn't the same as the one we'd lost. But it was growing and it was ours. I still drive past Sandra's house sometimes. The lights are on. Her car is in the driveway. She hasn't moved or hadn't as of late spring. The neighborhood is quieter now. People talk to each other differently at block parties. There's more honesty in it, I think. The kind that comes after a community has been through something uncomfortable together and come out the other side. What I carry from this isn't the victory, such as it was. It's something Ed said to me one evening, sitting on my porch after it was all over, watching the light go amber through the trees on Willowmere Drive. He said, "The thing about people like Sandra is that they depend on everyone else being too tired or too busy or too afraid to push back. The moment one person decides not to be, the whole thing starts to fall apart." I thought about the 3 homeowners Paula had mentioned, the ones who had just paid the fine and gone quiet. I thought about how close I'd come to doing the same. I didn't go quiet, that's all. And it turned out that was enough. Paula called the victory modest. Marcus called it significant. Ed called it satisfying. Carmen called it overdue. I called it Tuesday eventually because that's what justice looks like most of the time. Not a dramatic courtroom scene, but a board meeting where a bad policy gets erased and a bully loses the room and a stone wall gets its permit back on the record. It's Tuesday. It's overdue. And it's enough. The wedding that Sandra tried to hold in my backyard ended up becoming something the neighborhood talked about for a long time. Not with cruelty, mostly, more with the particular mixture of shock and dark humor that communities use to process things that are both outrageous and slightly absurd. Several people told me they'd seen the video before it was taken down. One woman told me she'd watched the tent go down 3 times and laughed harder each time. I told her I hadn't laughed. She said, "No, but you can now." I thought about it. Maybe. Someday. There's one more thing I want to say, and it's about power, the small, local, residential kind that Sandra wielded and I reclaimed. HOA boards have real authority over real people's real lives. They can fine you, restrict you, make your home feel like a place with rules written by someone who doesn't like you. That authority, used well, makes neighborhoods better. Used by someone like Sandra, it makes them smaller. What she didn't count on was that the same structures she used, the rules, the documentation, the procedures, the county filings, were available to me too. I just had to learn to use them. I used them. And in the end, the fire truck came not because I called it to ruin a wedding, but because Sandra had filed my home as a public venue with the county without my consent. And public venues require fire inspections, and Ed Mackey knew the right people, and the wind was blowing east that October morning. The water that brought down the tent wasn't aimed at Sandra's wedding. It was aimed at a hydrant test on a compliance check at an address that Sandra herself had registered. She built the stage. She set the scene. All I did was refuse to leave. But the story didn't end at paragraph 100. It rarely does. Real life doesn't wrap up at the moment of peak satisfaction. It continues into the Tuesday mornings that come after, into the conversations you have that you didn't expect, into the things you learn about people and systems and yourself when the dust has settled and you're standing in your own backyard again trying to figure out what all of it meant. Let me go back to something I skimmed past earlier. When I said Sandra kept files on homeowners, I want to be clear about what I mean because I only found out the full extent of it after the board changed over. Paula, now president, did a full review of the HOA administrative records. What she found in the shared digital files was a folder labeled Community Relations, Confidential. Inside were subfolder for 23 of the 31 homeowners on Willowmere Drive. My folder was one of the thicker ones. It included photocopies of publicly filed permits, mine and my neighbors, notes on vehicles that visited my property, a record of every email I'd sent to the HOA including replies from the early days when I'd responded to routine newsletters. There was a note, dated the month I joined the landscaping committee, that read, Reyes, engaged, potential advocate or obstacle. Monitor. I stared at that note for a long time. It was chillingly clinical. Paula's folder was even thicker. So was Ed's. The files on people Sandra considered allies, Tom Brewer, for instance, were sparse, mostly positive notations, things like cooperative on fence variance and good community spirit. But the files on anyone who'd ever questioned Sandra, even mildly, were detailed and careful. There were notes on financial stress indicators, a for sale sign that went up and came down, a car that was repossessed, a bankruptcy filing that was public record. She was building leverage files. Not illegally, mostly. Everything she'd noted was technically public or observable. But the intent was unmistakable. Marcus reviewed the files and told me that while the record-keeping itself wasn't necessarily actionable, combined with the threatening phone call and the retaliatory violation notice, it painted a pattern that significantly strengthened the AG's investigation. He submitted everything. The folder labeled Reyes Potential Obstacle became, in a certain sense, its own kind of evidence. Sandra had been so meticulous in her documentation of perceived threats that she had documented her own state of mind perfectly. Tom Brewer called me in late October. I almost didn't answer that one either. He was awkward on the phone. A man who is not used to apologizing and is attempting to do so anyway. He said he hadn't known about the wedding. He said he thought it was genuinely a neighborhood event. He said he was sorry he'd voted for a policy he hadn't read carefully enough. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it mostly. He hadn't been malicious. He'd been lazy and deferential, which isn't the same thing, even if the outcomes can rhyme. Tom did something I hadn't expected. He offered to provide a written statement to the AG's office confirming that Sandra had not disclosed the personal nature of the planned event to board members when presenting the community space utilization policy. His statement was filed in November. It was one of several that collectively confirmed Sandra had misrepresented the purpose of the policy to the people who voted for it. She hadn't just deceived me, she'd deceived her own allies. That felt important somehow, that her deception had been comprehensive, not targeted. It made the whole thing less personal and more structural. Lisa Cho resigned from the board in November, a week after the elections. She sent a long email to the neighborhood listserv, longer than Sandra's resignation letter, more honest than anything Sandra had written throughout the entire ordeal. She said she had genuinely believed in Sandra's vision for the neighborhood, but had failed to ask enough questions, failed to read documents carefully, failed to push back when things felt off. She called it a failure of her own judgment and said she was sorry. It was the most unusual piece of neighborhood email I had ever received. I replied to tell her I respected her for writing it. She thanked me. There's a detail I want to return to because I've thought about it more than almost anything else from this entire episode. On the morning of the failed wedding, when Inspector Chavez told Sandra that reclassifying the event as a private gathering would void the HOA's authority to hold it on my property, Sandra's first instinct was to amend the filing, to change the documentation, to retroactively alter the record to escape the consequence. That instinct, that reflex toward revision, told me everything about how Sandra operated. Reality was something to be managed, not respected. The truth was a first draft, subject to editing. That instinct is exactly why she lost. You can't edit your way out of a recording. You can't revise your way past a certified mail receipt. You can't amend a county filing after the inspector is standing in front of you with a tablet showing the original submission. Sandra had spent years in an environment, our neighborhood, our HOA, where she controlled the documentation and therefore controlled the narrative. The moment she encountered documentation she couldn't control, the whole structure collapsed. I've talked to Marcus about this several times since. He says he sees it regularly in HOA disputes, that HOA presidents who've been in power a long time often lose track of the difference between what they've decided and what's actually legal, between what they believe is justified and what the rules actually allow. They start to feel like the system is whatever they say it is. Sandra felt that more intensely than most, he said, because she was also genuinely intelligent, genuinely organized, and had genuinely been right about a lot of things in her first years as president. Being right repeatedly with nobody pushing back does something to a person. November brought a twist I had not anticipated. Marcus received a call from an attorney representing a former homeowner, a couple named the Garcias, who had lived on Willowmere Drive 3 years ago and moved away after what they described to their friends as an HOA nightmare. Their attorney had seen the news coverage. Yes, there had been a small local news piece, prompted by the viral neighborhood video, and reached out. The Garcias had a story about a retaliatory violation campaign that Sandra had waged against them after they'd opposed a neighborhood beautification fee she'd tried to add. They'd eventually sold their house and left. They wanted to participate in the AG investigation. There were others. Over the following 3 weeks, 2 more former residents reached out through Marcus or Paula with similar stories. People who had fought back against Sandra in smaller ways and lost, or given up, or moved. One was a single mother who'd been fined repeatedly for a mailbox that didn't meet HOA standards. A mailbox that was, by measurement, exactly 1 inch below the required height. The fines had accumulated. She'd eventually replaced it and then moved away within the year. She'd never connected her experience to a pattern. Now she was beginning to. The picture that emerged from all these accounts was systematic. Sandra had not accidentally stumbled into her position as an abusive HOA president. She had methodically cultivated it, cultivated allies, marginalized opposition, built leverage files, used procedures selectively, and created an atmosphere in which questioning her felt riskier than going along. She had done this deliberately, over years, in a small residential community of 31 homes. And the scale of it, the intention, the duration, the breadth, was what made it ultimately more than just a neighborhood dispute. The AG investigation formal notice arrived in January. It named Sandra Whitmore individually, not just the HOA, citing the fraudulent county filing and the recorded threat as the primary basis for investigation. Marcus told me this was significant, that individual officers in nonprofit organizations are often insulated from personal liability, but that Sandra had taken actions so personally directed and so clearly documented that the personal naming was justified. "She's not hiding behind the HOA anymore," he said. "This is about her." I felt the weight of that. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like a reckoning arriving on schedule. Sandra hired an attorney. A real one, expensive-looking, name partner level. His first action was to request that all documents related to the case be produced through formal discovery, rather than the informal sharing that Marcus and I had been doing with the AG's office. Marcus said that was standard. The second thing Sandra's attorney did was contact me directly, not Marcus, me, with a settlement proposal. It arrived by email on a Tuesday evening in January while I was making dinner. The settlement offer was structured as a mutual release. Sandra would waive any claim for damage to the tent and related wedding materials. I would waive any participation in or support of the AG's investigation, would agree not to discuss the events publicly, and would acknowledge that the community space utilization policy had been implemented in good faith. In exchange, Sandra would drop all outstanding HOA compliance actions against my property and pay my legal fees up to $5,000. I read it twice. Then I called Marcus. He said, "Absolutely not. I already knew, but I needed to hear him say it." I declined the settlement. I drafted my own response, short, formal, through Marcus, stating that I was not in a position to waive participation in a state investigation, that I did not acknowledge the policy had been implemented in good faith given the evidence on record, and that I had no outstanding compliance actions to be dropped since the valid ones had already been rescinded by the new board. The counteroffer was clean. The process continued. What I want to say about that settlement offer is this. It was, in its way, the final confirmation that Sandra knew she had done something wrong. People who believe they acted in good faith don't typically offer money and gag agreements. They fight on principle. Sandra was offering money. That told me more than any admission she could have made at a board meeting. February arrived. Brittany's rescheduled wedding happened at a venue in the city, a rooftop space overlooking the harbor. I know this because Paula mentioned it, having seen photos on social media. By all accounts, it was beautiful. Brittany looked happy. That genuinely pleased me. I had never had an objection to Brittany's wedding. My objection had always been to the way her mother had tried to appropriate my home to host it while threatening me into silence. The wedding itself deserved to be beautiful. And it was. Spring came. My yard recovered. The roses came back. The stone wall stood, as it always had, exactly where my grandfather and I had placed each stone the summer he was 74 and I was 36, and we talked for hours about property lines and family and what it means to build something that lasts. That summer is one of the memories I return to when things are difficult. My grandfather built things carefully and honestly and expected them to stand. I think about that when I look at the wall now. It stood. Everything Sandra tried to undo eventually stood. There's a thing that happens in neighborhoods when the dominant personality leaves. A kind of collective exhale, slow and communal and a little disbelieving. People start talking to each other differently. Old tensions surface and get aired and sometimes resolved. New ones form. But the particular tension that had organized everything, the single gravitational pull of Sandra's will, was gone, and the neighborhood had to figure out what it was without her. Paula was a good president. Practical, transparent, occasionally a little blunt in ways that Sandra never was. Sandra was always smooth, always managed, but honest in a way that created a different kind of trust. The first board meeting under Paula's leadership lasted 40 minutes because everything was on the agenda in advance. Everyone had read the documents, and nobody was managing anyone. It was almost boring. It was the best HOA meeting I had ever attended. I ran for the full board in the spring election. Ed encouraged me. Carmen thought I was crazy. You just spent 8 months fighting the HOA, she said. Now you want to be on it? I told her that was exactly why. The landscaping committee had been fine, but it had kept me at the edges of decisions, observer rather than participant, and I'd spent 8 months learning exactly how much that cost. If you're not at the table, someone else is shaping the rules. I'd learned that the hard way. I ran. I won, though narrowly. The first policy I helped draft on the new board was a formal conflict of interest disclosure requirement for all board members. If you had a personal financial interest in any HOA decision, any event, any vendor, any variance, you were required to disclose it in writing before the relevant vote and recuse yourself from voting on it. Simple. Obvious. The kind of thing that should have been in the original bylaws. We added it. We also added a formal homeowner notification requirement for any use of private property, with a minimum 30-day written consent period and no provision for implied or passive consent. We added it. We also added a whistleblower protection clause for homeowners who reported board misconduct. We added that too. Marcus reviewed the revised bylaws pro bono. He refused to charge me for it, which I tried to argue about and eventually accepted with gratitude. He said the changes were solid and represented genuine structural improvement. Ed said they were long overdue. Paula said, "We should have had all of this years ago." I said the person who'd been president before us had had reasons not to want them. Nobody argued with that. The AG investigation concluded in late spring of the following year, about 18 months after I'd first filed the supplemental complaint. The outcome was less dramatic than I'd imagined during the months when I'd hoped Sandra might face significant legal consequences. She was not criminally charged. The fraudulent county filing resulted in a civil fine, $1,700, and a 5-year prohibition on serving as an officer of any HOA or nonprofit organization in the state. Her attorney had negotiated it down from what the AG had initially proposed. But it was on the record. Permanently. Google her name now and the third result is the AG's public notice. Sandra did not respond publicly to the investigation outcome. Her attorney issued a statement saying she disagreed with the characterization of her actions but had chosen to accept the resolution to avoid further disruption to her family and community. There was no apology. I had not expected one, and I'd made peace with that. People like Sandra very rarely apologize in the way you want them to, with understanding, with genuine acknowledgement of harm. They issue statements. They accept resolutions. They move on. So do you eventually? You have to. There was one more twist, the last one, and the one that I sat with longest because I genuinely hadn't seen it coming, and I thought I'd seen everything at that point. It came from an unexpected direction. Marcus. 6 weeks after the AG's investigation concluded, he called to tell me that he'd received a letter from Sandra's attorney, not about our case, about a different matter entirely. Sandra was suing the event rental company whose tent stakes had damaged her daughter's wedding materials during the collapse. The suit alleged negligent setup on a contested property. In making that argument, her attorney had been forced to acknowledge, in writing in a legal filing, that the property had been in dispute at the time of the event. That Sandra had known about the homeowner's objections. That the event had proceeded without valid consent. It was, in essence, an admission, buried in a civil complaint against a tent company. Marcus forwarded it to the AG's office. It was filed as supplemental material to the already closed investigation. Whether it changed anything substantive, I don't know. What I know is that Sandra's attempt to sue for damages from the tent collapse ended up creating the clearest, most direct acknowledgement of her own wrongdoing that she'd ever been forced to put on paper. She'd reached for one more advantage and handed her opponents the one thing they'd been missing. Even at the end, she was still trying to win. And she handed me the last piece instead. I think about the kind of person Sandra was, and I try to be fair. She was organized, she was smart, she cared about the neighborhood in her own way, her own controlling, hierarchical, self-serving way, but she cared. The street did look better under her presidency in some ways. The common areas were well maintained. Some of the variance decisions she'd made were genuinely good ones. She wasn't a villain in every dimension. She was a person who had found a system she could dominate and had dominated it until the domination became indistinguishable from the purpose. That's what power does to some people in small systems. It doesn't corrupt them suddenly. It just gradually removes the feedback mechanisms that would have told them they'd gone too far. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said no. Nobody kept receipts. Until I did. Until Ed did. Until Paula had been quietly keeping her own folder all along, waiting for a moment when something irrefutable happened that she could attach all her documentation to. We had all been prepared in our different ways. Sandra just hadn't believed anyone would use what they had. Late one Sunday evening in May, almost 2 years after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my porch when Mrs. Fujita came by on her evening walk and stopped at the gate. She said, "Your roses are coming in beautiful this year." I said Carmen had worked hard on them. She looked at the yard for a moment. The stone wall, the garden gate, the porch where Ed and I had stood with our coffee cups that October morning. And then she looked at me and said, "You know, I never liked those wind chimes anyway." I started laughing. She smiled with complete serenity and continued her walk. "That's my neighborhood. After everything, after the certified letters and the board meetings and the fire truck and the tent and the AG investigation, it's still my neighborhood. The woman who spent years trying to control it is living down the street in a house where the lights still go on every evening. My grandfather's wall is still standing. Carmen's roses came back. My kids grew another year older. Life continued in the particular, unheroic, daily way that life continues when the crisis is over and you're still there, still living it. I'm still on the board. Ed is still on the board. Paula is still president, running for her second term. The HOA newsletters have gotten shorter and more factual. The meetings are shorter too. Nobody keeps files on anyone. Nobody sends threatening phone calls. The conflict of interest policy has been invoked once. Tom Brewer had to recuse himself from a vote about a vendor his brother-in-law worked for, and he did it without complaint, and the meeting moved on. That's what a functioning system looks like. Not dramatic, just honest. There are people who heard about what happened at 14 Willowmere Drive and found it funny, and I understand that. The image of a tent collapsing mid-setup for an unauthorized wedding while a fire engine idles at the curb is inherently cinematic. Plays like a scene from a movie where you root for the underdog and the villain gets wet. And yes, there's a part of me that sees the comedy in it now. Time does that. But what I want people to take from this story isn't the comedy. It's the 7 months before the comedy. The certified letters and the legal fees and the board meetings and the late nights reading bylaws and the moments of doubt when I wondered if it was worth it. It's the three homeowners who had similar experiences and gave up. It's the Garcia family who sold their house. It's Mrs. Fujita's wind chimes, which by every account were lovely and never bothered a soul. The comedy is real. The cost behind it is also real. Both things can be true. What I hope people take, if they take anything, document everything. Know your rights. Find the Ed in your neighborhood, the person who's been around long enough to know which calls to make. Find the Paula, the person who's been keeping their own quiet records. Trust that the same systems a bully uses can be turned around if you learn to use them. And don't go quiet. The cost of not going quiet is high. The cost of going quiet is higher. My son Marco, who is now 18 and heading to college in the fall, asked me recently what the whole thing had taught me. I thought about it for a while. I said, it taught me that institutions are only as good as the people willing to hold them accountable. And that one person deciding not to be tired is sometimes all it takes. Marco thought about that. He said, but you were tired. I said, yeah, I did it tired. He seemed to find that more useful than any other version of the lesson. Probably because it was the truest. Carmen never asked for an apology from Sandra. I asked her once if she wanted one. Not for me to pursue it just personally, if she felt like she needed it. She thought about it. Then she said, what I needed was for the roses to come back. They did. That's Carmen. She has always known exactly what matters and been completely precise about asking for it. I married well. Every difficult thing is survivable when you have the right person in the house with you. The new dawn rose bloomed for the first time this May. Pale pink, climbing the gate post where Carmen trained it through the winter. It was not the same as the one we'd lost. It wasn't trying to be. It was its own thing, beginning its own time on that gate post, knowing nothing about tent stakes or HOA policies or a cold October morning when a fire truck came down Willowmere Drive. It just bloomed, the way things do when you tend them carefully and give them enough time and refuse to stop. I want to circle back to something Paula told me near the end, after the AG investigation, after the bylaw revisions, after Sandra's resignation had settled into just a fact of the neighborhood's recent history. She said she thought Sandra had always believed, on some level, that she was doing what was right. That she genuinely thought the community space utilization policy was clever and beneficial, that she was improving the neighborhood by controlling it, that my objections were unreasonable and my lawyer was an attack on something she'd built in good faith. She never saw herself as the villain, Paula said. I said that made it more interesting, not less, because if Sandra had known she was wrong and done it anyway, that would be one kind of story. But if Sandra genuinely believed her own framing, believed that passive consent was real, that her daughter's wedding constituted community benefit, that threatening my variance approvals was legitimate pressure rather than retaliation, then what happened to her wasn't a villain getting caught. It was someone finally encountering a reality that didn't match her map of it. And that, in its own way, is a sadder story. A more human one. I don't know if Sandra ever had that reckoning. The private one, the kind you have alone at 3 in the morning when nobody's watching and the performance is turned off. I don't know if she ever sat in her McMansion at the end of the cul-de-sac and thought, I was wrong. I don't know because I'm not her and I was never her and I've never wanted to be. But I think about it. I think about what it costs to be someone who can't admit wrongdoing, the energy of maintaining that, the loneliness of it, the way it must feel to sit at a board meeting and smile while your entire position is crumbling and you can't show a crack because showing a crack has never been an option. Costs a lot to be Sandra Whitmore. I'm certain of that. The tent rental company, for what it's worth, settled Sandra's lawsuit quickly and for a small amount. Their attorney established without much difficulty that the event had been held without property owner consent, and that the presence of county inspectors on site constituted evidence that the setup itself was irregular. The settlement documents, which Marcus obtained through a public filing process, noted that the company assumed no liability for events occurring in connection with property disputes not disclosed at time of contract. In other words, Sandra hadn't told them the property was contested. Another thing she hadn't disclosed. Another entry on the record. My filing cabinet has a new section now. I labeled it HOA Resolved. Inside are the certified mail receipts, the county filings, the AG correspondence, the board minutes, the recording transcript, the violation notices, the rescission documents, and the final investigation outcome. 60-some documents organized chronologically. Marcus made me keep everything. As long as you own that house, he said. Keep the file. I keep the file. The building permit for the stone wall is framed on my office wall, next to where the violation notice used to hang. I replaced the violation notice with a photo Carmen took that October afternoon. The fire truck parked at the curb, the collapsed tent visible in the background. Me standing on the porch steps holding a coffee cup. I look calm in the photo. I was calmer than I expected to be. That's the thing about being prepared. When the moment comes, there's very little left to panic about. You've already done the work. You just stand there and let it happen. That photo is my reminder on the days when the HOA sends a routine email about gutter maintenance and I feel that old familiar wariness, the reflex I developed during 8 months of Sandra, that I did this. I held my ground. I documented carefully. I found the right people. I refused the settlement. I showed up to the meetings. I let the process work. And when the fire truck came, I stood on my porch with my coffee and I watched. You stand. You let it happen. That's what you do. And here is what nobody tells you about standing your ground in a small place against a person with local power. It doesn't make you a hero. You don't get a parade. The neighborhood doesn't gather and applaud. Sandra's allies don't become your friends. The HOA doesn't suddenly become paradise. What you get is your yard back. Your wall. Your permits. Your roses, mostly. A new board that does things honestly. A quieter street. Tuesday mornings where the only HOA email is about gutter maintenance. That's all. That's everything. The Friday before I ran for the board, I walked the whole length of Willowmere Drive for the first time in months just to look at it. All 31 houses. The lawns and the mailboxes and the cars in the driveways and the lights coming on in the windows as evening settled in. This is the place I chose to build my life. This is where my kids grew up. This is where my grandfather and I built a stone wall on a summer afternoon, talking about what lasts. I walked the street and thought, this is worth defending. Not dramatically, not heroically, just stubbornly, carefully, and all the way to the end. So when people ask me, and they do because the neighborhood video spread farther than any of us expected, how did you get the fire truck to come? The honest answer is, I didn't. The fire truck came because Sandra filed my house as a public venue without my consent, which triggered a legally mandated inspection, which Ed's contact at the fire marshal's office scheduled on the morning of the event, per standard procedure. The only thing I did was refuse to stop objecting. The machinery did the rest. Sandra's own paperwork called the fire truck. I just didn't get out of the way. There's something almost poetic about that, I think. About a woman who spent years managing documentation to control her environment, who finally encountered documentation she hadn't written and couldn't control. The fire inspection form, the certified mail receipt, the recording, the AG referral, the tent company lawsuit filing. Each one a document she hadn't authored, hadn't managed, hadn't seen coming. The tools she'd used to build her power were the same tools that undid it. She was defeated by paperwork. Her own paperwork and mine. I've started going to HOA information nights at the county extension office. They hold them a few times a year, free sessions for homeowners on their rights, HOA regulations, what's enforceable and what isn't. I go and I sit in the back, and sometimes, at the end, I tell people a shortened version of this story. Not to be dramatic, just to say, know your rights, document everything, Find your ed. The people in those rooms are usually surprised that any of it is possible, that an HOA president can be held accountable, that a state AG's office will actually look at a complaint, that a fire inspection can show up on a Saturday morning and change everything. They shouldn't be surprised. These protections exist. They just require someone to use them. That someone, in my case, was me. Reluctantly, expensively, sleeplessly, but me. And I would do it again. Let me tell you about the morning after the failed wedding, because I didn't fully describe it and it deserves its own moment. Sunday. Carmen made pancakes. Marco ate 4 of them without looking up from his phone. Sophia helped clear the table. We did the dishes. Normal Sunday. Then Carmen went outside to assess the rose garden, and I followed her, and we stood together in the morning light looking at the bent bushes and the stake holes and the flattened grass where the tent had been. Carmen was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We're going to need compost." I went and got the compost. We spent the morning in the garden together. By noon, it looked survivable. By spring, it looked like ours again. I think of that Sunday morning when the HOA dynamics get tense. And they do, even under Paula, even with the new bylaws, because neighborhood governance is inherently tense and any group of 31 homeowners is going to find things to disagree about. I think of Carmen saying, "We're going to need compost," and going to get it, matter-of-factly, without drama, without grievance. That's the right tone for all of this in the end. Not triumph. Just here is the work. Here are the tools. Let's get started. There's a footnote to the story that involves Tom Brewer, and I include it because it's unexpected in a way that redeemed him somewhat in my estimation. In January of the second year, about 4 months after the failed wedding, Tom came to a board meeting and asked, unprompted, to add an agenda item. He proposed that the HOA create a small community fund, $50 from each household annually, to maintain the common garden areas and contribute to a neighbor-in-need fund for things like emergency landscaping repairs after storm damage. He presented it well. He clearly thought it through. Passed unanimously. The first disbursement from the neighbor-in-need fund, that spring, went to help an elderly couple on our street fix storm damage to their backyard fence. Tom organized the volunteers. I helped. People can surprise you. That's the thing. Tom had been Sandra's yes man, had voted for a policy without reading it, had enabled months of abuse by not asking enough questions. And then, when the structure he'd been deferring to collapsed, he had to figure out who he actually was. Apparently, he was someone who wanted to build a community fund and fix an elderly couple's fence. I don't know what to do with that except to say, people are complicated, and sometimes the version of a person who emerges after a reckoning is better than the version who existed before it. Lisa Cho came back to a board meeting in the spring, not as a member but as a regular attendee. She sat in the same spot she'd always sat in and took notes, old habit probably, and asked good questions during public comment. Paula welcomed her back without making it a thing. I nodded when she walked in. She nodded back. That was enough. There were other changes too, smaller ones, that I noticed over time. The neighborhood email tone changed. Less formal, less managed. When someone had a concern, they said it directly instead of framing it as a community question for consideration. When there was a dispute about a fence line last summer, both homeowners came to the board meeting and talked it out in 30 minutes. Nobody filed a preemptive violation notice. Nobody built a leverage file. They just talked. The board listened. They reached an agreement. It was startlingly, almost disarmingly normal. I've thought about why it changed, specifically. Some of it is Paula, her style sets a different tone. Some of it is the new bylaws, which create clearer procedural guardrails. But I think a lot of it is just that people watched what happened with Sandra and absorbed a lesson without articulating it. They saw what happens when the power in a small system goes unchecked. They saw how far it can go and how ugly it can get and what it costs everyone, not just the target but the community, and they chose, quietly and collectively, to try to be different. That's the most hopeful thing I can tell you about Willowmere Drive. The neighborhood learned something. Not perfectly, not permanently, power dynamics shift, people move in and out, the next Sandra is always theoretically possible. But for now, in this particular spring with this particular group of neighbors, the street feels different. Lighter, more honest, more itself. I want to say something about what it means to be a homeowner specifically, about what that word holds and what it costs and what it's worth. There's a particular vulnerability in homeownership that people don't talk about enough. The fact that your home, the place you've invested your money and your years and your identity, is embedded in a community of other people's decisions, other people's rules, other people's values. You can own your house outright and still have someone else's HOA policy fundamentally affect your daily life. You can do everything right and still have a Sandra tape a violation notice to your door. That vulnerability is real. And it can make people feel like they have no power, like the system is always against them, like the only rational response is to keep your head down and pay the fine and not make waves. I understand that feeling. I felt it myself in the months when Sandra's letters were coming in and I didn't know if I had enough documentation, enough legal support, enough energy to see it through. The feeling of powerlessness is one of her most effective weapons. Feeling it doesn't mean you are. You are not powerless if you have a certified mail receipt. You are not powerless if you have a recorded phone call. You are not powerless if you have an attorney friend who owes you a favor and a retired fire captain who still knows people. You are not powerless if you're willing to show up at the board meeting and read from a prepared statement and not flinch when the president pretends not to see your hand. Power isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act anyway. I acted anyway. Tired, scared, occasionally furious, spending money I hadn't budgeted for attorney fees, losing sleep I needed, arguing with my wife about my stress levels. I acted anyway. And the tent came down. Not because I was powerful, because I didn't stop. The video from that October morning, the one that got shared 47 times before Sandra took it down, I've never watched. Not the full version. I saw a few seconds of it when Paula sent it to me as evidence documentation, and I stopped it. I didn't need to see it. I was there. I remember what it felt like to stand on that porch with the coffee cup and watch the machinery of Sandra's overreach encounter the machinery of its own consequences. I don't need a recording of it. It's inside me. It will always be inside me. What I carry instead is the Tuesday afternoon in November when the board voted to rescind the policy and Gary Holt, who had voted for it without reading it, voted to erase it. I carry Paula saying, "Motion carries," in her flat, clear, undecorated voice. I carry Ed beside me at that porch railing in October, not saying anything, just standing there. I carry Carmen in the garden on Sunday morning, matter-of-factly, with her gloves and her compost. I carry Brittany saying to her mother, "Mom, stop." I carry those moments because they are the real story, not the tent coming down, but all the quiet, human things that happened before and around it that made it possible. I'm writing this from my porch. It's evening. The new dawn rose is climbing the gate post, pale and stubborn and new. The stone wall runs along the north property line exactly where it should. The HOA newsletter came this week, 4 paragraphs, a reminder about yard waste pickup, a note about the upcoming block party. Normal, ordinary, ours. From inside the house, I can hear Carmen on the phone with her sister, laughing. Marco is playing music in his room. Something I don't recognize, something loud and full of energy, the sound of a teenager becoming his own person in the house where he grew up. Sophia is at the kitchen table doing homework, her voice occasionally rising when she finds something frustrating and then settling again. These sounds, this particular combination of sounds, are what the whole fight was for. Not principle, not precedent, not even justice exactly. A neighbor I barely knew, David Park, who lives 3 houses down and mostly keeps to himself, waved at me from his driveway this evening as I came out to sit on the porch. Just a wave. I waved back. That was it. Two neighbors acknowledging each other on a warm spring evening on a quiet street. Nothing dramatic. Nothing required. But David Park used to avoid eye contact during the worst months of the conflict, when he didn't know whose side to be on. Tonight he waved. Small things on a street like this are not small. I found out in March, almost a year and a half after the failed wedding, that Sandra had begun attending a different neighborhood association, several miles away. Not as president, just as a resident. Someone who'd moved into that neighborhood mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance, who mentioned it to Paula, who mentioned it to me. Apparently Sandra had gotten involved in the garden committee. Apparently she had strong opinions about mulch. I felt something when I heard that. I'm not sure what to call it. Not triumph. Something closer to recognition. She's still herself wherever she is. The need to organize and control and improve doesn't disappear. It just moves. I hope, for that garden committee's sake, that she's found a version of it that doesn't require leverage files and certified letters. But I don't know. Some things in people don't change without something really breaking open in them. Sandra's thing broke open very publicly on my lawn on an October Saturday. Whether it changed anything in her, I genuinely don't know. That's her story, not mine. Paula told me something once that I've thought about many times. She said that the hardest part of the whole ordeal wasn't fighting Sandra. It was watching other people go along with her for so long. Not because they agreed with her, Paula said. Because it felt easier. Because standing up costs something and going along feels free. It's not free. It just defers the cost. She said it quietly, looking out the window at the street. Then she said, "You paid your dues early. Some people pay them later. Some people never do, and the cost just accumulates in ways they can't see. I paid mine early in this case. 7 months of letters and meetings and recordings and legal fees and stress. I paid them in full. And then I got my yard back. There are mornings when I walk the perimeter of my property just to do it. Not to check anything, not to inspect anything, just to be in it. The north wall, the garden, the oak tree, the flagstone patio, the back gate where the new dawn rose is climbing. My property. My family's. My grandfather helped build part of it. My kids grew up in it. My wife's roses came back in it after someone's tent collapsed on them. It's not a metaphor. It's a yard. But it's mine, and on the mornings when I walk it, I know it in my bones in a way I didn't before all this happened. Conflict does that sometimes. Clarifies. Reminds you what you have by forcing you to fight for it. I would rather not have had to fight. I would rather Sandra had never moved to our street, or had moved here and been a good neighbor, or had at least stopped before filing my address with the county. But she didn't, and the fight clarified things for me. About the house, about the neighborhood, about what I'm willing to defend and how far I'll go to defend it. I'll go all the way. That's the answer. To the state AG's office. To a board meeting with a prepared statement. To a porch on an October morning with a coffee cup, watching the consequences arrive. One afternoon in June, I found a note tucked into my mailbox. Handwritten, on plain paper, no return address. It said, "Thank you for fighting back. We didn't know we could." A former resident. I don't know who wrote it. Could be one of the homeowners who reached out to the AG. Could be a Garcia. Could be someone I never met who just heard about it. I kept the note. It's in the filing cabinet in the HOA resolved section at the back. It's the last thing in the file. I like that it's handwritten. It feels right, personal, specific, human, in a story that has spent a lot of time in the territory of certified letters and county filings and formal complaints. Someone wrote it by hand and walked to my mailbox and tucked it in. That took something. Not a lot, but something. We didn't know we could. That's the line. That's the whole story in 5 words. The assumption of powerlessness is so often the actual power of the person oppressing you. Remove the assumption and the power shifts. Know you can fight back and you can. It doesn't guarantee you'll win. Sandra had beaten people before me who had tried. But the ones who try are the ones who change the story. Sometimes for themselves. Sometimes for the people who come next. I came next for the people who came before me. I tried because I was stubborn and had a good lawyer and a retired fire captain and a wife with compost and a daughter of Sandra's who said, "Mom, stop," at exactly the right moment. None of that was guaranteed. But all of it was there. You work with what's there. The block party this summer was held in the actual common area. The green space near the entrance of the neighborhood that the original HOA had designated for community gatherings when the development was first built. Years before Sandra arrived and decided she needed something more impressive. Folding tables. Potluck. Kids running around. Mrs. Fujita brought dumplings. Tom Brewer grilled hot dogs and seemed genuinely happy about it. Ed came in a shirt that had a pocket protector, which is very on-brand. Carmen brought tres leches cake and it was gone in 15 minutes. Paula gave a short welcome. She's not a big speech person. And mentioned that the neighborhood had been through some changes in the past couple of years, and she was grateful for the community's resilience. No names. No details. Just resilience. People nodded. Drinks were lifted. The kids ran back and forth. It was an ordinary summer evening in an American neighborhood, and it was exactly what it should be. I stood at the edge of the party for a while, holding a cold drink, looking at the people I lived around. 31 households, maybe 65, 70 people on this block. Accountants, nurses, teachers, an auto mechanic, a retired math professor, a young couple who'd moved in last winter and were still figuring out the neighborhood. They had arguments and histories and complicated relationships with each other that had nothing to do with me. They had lives. They had their own stone walls, their own roses, their own things worth defending. I thought about Sandra. She wasn't there. Her house was dark when I walked past it on the way to the party. I don't know if she was inside or away. I thought about the filing cabinet. I thought about the note in my mailbox. I thought about my grandfather, who would have understood all of this in his bones. The stone wall, the property line, the principle of standing your ground in a small place, and who also would have told me to stop thinking so much and eat the cake. I went and got a piece of Carmen's tres leches. It was perfect. Everything was exactly where it should be. The END is not a dramatic moment. It's this. A summer evening, a potluck, a community that chose to be a community again. It's Carmen's rose on the gatepost. It's my grandfather's wall on the north property line. It's the new bylaws in the board's filing system. It's the AG's notice on the public record. It's me on my porch on a Tuesday reading a 4-paragraph newsletter about yard waste pickup. It's ordinary. It's ours. That's enough. Sandra Whitmore tried to hold a wedding in my backyard. Ed called the fire department. The tent came down. The HOA policy was erased. The president resigned. The investigation concluded. The roses came back. And Willowmere Drive kept going, the way streets do, carrying its residents through their ordinary, extraordinary lives on the particular block of American ground they chose to call home. That's the whole story. What's left is just the living of it. There is one question I get asked more than any other when I tell this story. Were you afraid? The honest answer is yes, consistently and in layers. I was afraid in the early months that I was wrong about the legal footing, that Sandra's passive consent claim would hold, that the policy would survive a challenge, that I'd spend money and energy and end up losing anyway. I was afraid of the retaliatory fine on the stone wall, not because I thought it would succeed, but because it showed me how many tools Sandra had and how willing she was to use them all at once. I was afraid in September when Marcus filed the cease and desist and the phone rang and Sandra's voice came on the line perfectly calm and perfectly threatening. That was a fear of a different kind, the recognition that she was not going to stop, that the thing I'd tried to keep procedural was going to become personal, and that I had to decide in real time whether I was still in it. I was afraid and I stayed in it, and then I recorded the call. Fear and action are not mutually exclusive. They coexist more often than people admit. I was afraid the morning of the failed wedding. Not dramatically. Not heart-pounding, not nauseating. But the quiet, low-grade fear of someone who has put months of preparation into a confrontation and is now standing at the edge of it. What if the inspector doesn't come? What if Sandra has filed something to block it? What if the crew goes ahead anyway and it turns into something legally ugly? I stood on my porch and drank my coffee and was afraid. And then Inspector Chavez's county vehicle pulled up at 7:45 and the fear shifted into something else. Not confidence, just motion. The thing was in motion now. After the tent came down, the fear went away. Completely, suddenly, like a door closing. I thought about why. I think it's because the worst case I'd been imagining for 8 months. Sandra wins, the wedding happens, I have no recourse. Didn't happen. Not because I was invincible, but because I'd prepared. The fear had been fuel. Once the thing it was fueling was done, there was nothing left for it to burn. I slept well that night too. Both Saturday nights, the one before and the one after. I mention this because people assume you can't sleep under this kind of stress, and sometimes you can't. But sometimes, when you've done everything you can do and you've handed the rest to the process and the process is working, your body recognizes that you've held up your end. And you sleep. I slept. Marco asked me once, during the worst of it, if I ever thought about just moving. Just selling the house and going somewhere without an HOA. I thought about it seriously before I answered. And I said, maybe, but not because of Sandra. Because the house deserved to be left on our terms, not hers. And because my grandfather helped build that wall. And because Carmen's roses were in the ground. Some things you don't leave until you're ready to leave them. We weren't ready. So we stayed and we fought, and the house is still ours and we're still here. I'm still here. So is the wall. So are the roses. The fire truck came. The tent fell. Sandra Whitmore resigned. Pauline Gwynn is president. Ed Mackey is on the board. The bylaws are better. The newsletter is 4 paragraphs. Tuesday mornings are quiet. That's how it ends. Not with a bang. Not with a courtroom scene. Not with Sandra in handcuffs or the neighborhood throwing me a parade. Just with the thing being over, and the ordinary life that was always here waiting for it to be over resuming, carrying all of us forward on Willowmere Drive into the unremarkable, irreplaceable days that actually make up a life. And if you ever find yourself staring at a certified letter from an HOA claiming you've passively consented to your own backyard being used for someone else's daughter's wedding, document everything. Find your Ed. Call your Marcus. Show up to the meeting. Read the prepared statement. Stand on the porch with your coffee. Don't go quiet. The fire truck will come when it's supposed to. Trust the process, build the record, and hold your ground. The tent, in my experience, comes down all on its own. I want to go back to a detail I glossed over, the moment Ed Mackey walked around the corner of my house that October morning. I described it quickly, but I want to slow down and stay in it, because it was one of those moments where you feel the support of another person as something almost physical. He didn't rush. He didn't perform urgency. He just appeared, calm and purposeful, holding his phone, and walked across my lawn with the authority of someone who has dealt with emergencies for 30 years and knows that calm is the most powerful tool in any crisis. Ed Mackey is 61 years old. He retired from the county fire department after 32 years, started as a line firefighter, ended as a captain. He moved to Willowmere Drive 6 years ago with his wife Diane and their dog, a large indifferent hound named Biscuit who treats the neighborhood block party as a personal buffet. Ed joined the HOA board because Diane told him to get involved somewhere. He'd been skeptical of Sandra from the beginning. A professional lifetime of reading people under pressure gives you a particular instinct for those who manage rather than lead, but he'd picked his battles carefully. Until I gave him one worth picking. What Ed brought to this was something I couldn't have replicated with documentation alone. The institutional knowledge of how county agencies actually work. Not the theoretical knowledge you get from reading regulations, but the operational knowledge of someone who has interfaced with those agencies in professional contexts for decades. He knew which office to call. He knew how to frame a request so it moved through the system instead of getting deprioritized. He knew that a mandated fire inspection doesn't require anyone's permission. It requires a qualifying trigger, and Sandra's county filing provided exactly that. He knew all of this the way you know things that are part of your work history. None of this was dramatic on his end. He made phone calls. He provided documentation. He coordinated. He showed up on an October morning and said the right things to a fire inspector and stood on a porch and didn't say anything at all when that was the right call. That's what the right kind of support looks like. It doesn't announce itself, it just arrives and does what needs doing. I've tried to be that for other people since. I'm not sure I'm as good at it as Ed, but I'm trying. There's a moment I want to describe that I've been circling around because it's small and I'm not sure it belongs in the story, and then I keep deciding it does. The morning the tent came down, Saturday, October, my daughter Sophia was at a friend's house. My son Marco was in his room. Carmen was in the house. I was on the porch. And before the inspector arrived, before anything dramatic happened, there was a window of about 15 minutes when the setup crew was working quietly in my yard and the October. Light was doing something beautiful with the tent fabric and the flowers and the rose garden, and my yard looked, for exactly that brief window, like it was hosting something lovely. I stood on the porch and I thought, in another world, this could have been a good thing. An actual community wedding. My actual consent, given genuinely, for something I'd had a real say in. Flowers in my garden, people celebrating, white linen in the October light. In that other world, Sandra would have asked me honestly and offered something real, and I might have said yes. It's a nice yard. It would have made a nice venue. But that's the other world. In this one, she assumed she didn't need to ask. She was wrong. I've thought about that 15-minute window a lot. About the gap between what something could have been and what it actually was. About how much of Sandra's failure was the thing she did versus the way she chose to do it. If she had come to me in January with honesty, my daughter's getting married, I'd love to use your yard, here's what I'm offering, let me know. I might have said yes. I'll never know. She didn't ask. She commanded. And commanding your neighbors is not the same thing as living with them. The difference between a neighborhood and a fiefdom is consent. That's really what this story is about at its core. Not the tent. Not the fire truck. Not the AG investigation. Consent. Whether the people who live in a place have genuine, informed, voluntary say over what happens to their homes and their lives. Sandra believed consent was hers to assume, to manufacture, to claim from silence. I believed it was mine to give or withhold. One of us was right. Paula told me that when she first started keeping her documentation files on Sandra, the procedural violations, the meeting minute edits, the selective enforcement records, she wasn't sure anything would ever come of it. I just knew someone would need it eventually, she said. Someone would push back far enough that the documentation would matter. I didn't know it would be you, but I kept the files. I asked her how long she'd been keeping them. She said 4 years. Almost the entirety of Sandra's presidency. Paula had been building her file while Sandra was building hers. Two women with clipboards, heading toward each other on a collision course that neither of them could precisely time. The difference between their files was this. Sandra's were designed to control people. Paula's were designed to protect them. Same impulse toward organization, directed toward entirely opposite ends. Same tool, different purpose. That's not a small thing. I think about Sandra's file sometimes. The one labeled, Reyes, potential obstacle. The notes on my vehicles. The record of my emails. The date I joined the landscaping committee. She had built a profile of me as a threat before I'd ever been one. She had anticipated resistance from me before I knew there was anything to resist. In a certain way, she was right. I was the kind of person who would push back if pushed far enough. She just didn't think I'd push back far enough. She underestimated the distance I was willing to go. Most people, in my experience, underestimate that about relatively quiet people. Sandra read me as engaged and potentially cautious. Potential obstacle, not confirmed obstacle. She thought the passive consent gambit would work because I was the kind of person who showed up to meetings and sent polite emails. She didn't account for the possibility that a person can be polite and implacable at the same time. That you can write a formal objection in measured, courteous language and still mean every word of it absolutely. I mean every word of everything I write. That's not a personality trait so much as a professional habit. I'm a structural engineer. Imprecision in language has consequences I've been trained to take seriously. When I write, I do not consent to the use of my property. I do not consent to the use of my property. Sandra read it as an opening bid. It was not. It was exactly what it said. There's a lesson in that for anyone dealing with an HOA or any institutional authority that's learned to treat formal objections as negotiating positions rather than final answers. Be precise. Be clear. Use the specific language of the law and regulation you're invoking, not just your feelings about the situation. Say exactly what you mean. Don't soften it. Don't add qualifications. I do not consent is 3 words, and they should be the 3 words on the page. Then send it certified mail and keep the receipt. Marcus told me once that the single most valuable thing I did in the entire dispute was the first formal objection letter. Specifically, that I sent it within the 15-day window specified in the certified letter, cited the specific subsections I was invoking, and sent it certified mail. If you'd sent an email, Sandra could have claimed she didn't see it, he said. If you'd sent it late, the passive consent window would have closed. You sent it in time by the right method, citing the right provisions. He paused. Most people don't do that. They write an angry email. The angry email doesn't do anything. The angry email is satisfying in the moment and useless in the record. The certified letter is the thing. I want to say something directly to anyone who is in the middle of something like this right now, who is sitting with a violation notice or a threatening letter or a policy that seems designed specifically to disadvantage them. You are not imagining it. The discomfort you feel when you read the letter and something in you says this isn't right, that instinct is probably correct. The people who write these letters know they're on questionable ground. That's why they use passive consent language and dense policy documents and short response windows. They're hoping you won't look too closely, won't respond in time, won't know which subsections to cite. Look closely. Respond in time. Find the subsections. Find a Marcus. Find an Ed. Find a Paula. They exist in most communities. People who know things, who've been waiting for someone to use the knowledge, who are tired of watching the same patterns repeat. Connect with them. Build your record together. Don't be the person who sends the angry email and goes quiet. One of the things that surprised me most in retrospect was how many people in the neighborhood had been watching Sandra carefully for years and never said anything to each other. Ed had his instincts. Paula had her files. Mrs. Fujita had her observations. 3 former residents had their experiences. None of them had connected until I became the catalyst. That's a pattern I recognize from structural engineering. Stress accumulates silently in a system until one load-bearing event. The system looks fine. The stress is real. When the right force is applied, the whole structure reveals what it's been hiding. I was the right force applied at the right moment in the right direction. That sounds more intentional than it was. I was just a homeowner who objected to something and didn't stop objecting. The accumulated stress of the neighborhood found me and I happened to hold. That's all. The wall, you might say, was load-bearing. The stone wall my grandfather and I built runs 42 feet along the north property line. I know this because I measured it twice when I was drafting my response to the retaliatory violation notice. 42 feet. 7 inches thick at the base, 6 inches at the top. Gray fieldstone, mortared, set on a concrete footer we poured over 3 days the summer my grandfather was 74. He had arthritis in his left hand by then and wore a specific glove on that hand whenever we worked. He never complained about it. He just wore the glove. He taught me how to read a level and how to mix mortar and how to set a stone so it would stay. He said the most important thing about building a wall was patience, that you couldn't rush a wall, couldn't cut corners on the foundation, couldn't assume the ground would stay flat or the stones would stay level. You built it right or you built it again. I built it right, still standing. Sandra tried to tear it down with a violation notice. Still standing. I'm aware this is becoming a meditation on the wall as much as the conflict. That's intentional. The wall is the reason all of this means what it means to me. It's not the legal victory, important as that was. It's not the AG's record. It's the wall. The specific physical object that Sandra tried to unmake, arbitrarily and retaliatorily, as a show of force. And the fact that it is standing where it has always stood, permitted and legal and solid, made of stones my grandfather chose by hand, that is the most complete form of justice I experienced in this entire story. Everything else was procedural. The wall is personal. In the fall of the second year, almost exactly 12 months after the failed wedding, I had coffee with Ed on my porch on a Saturday morning. We sat in the same chairs we'd been standing near the year before. It was overcast and cool, same as before. Biscuit had come along and was sitting on the flagstone doing what Biscuit does, which is nothing, contentedly. We talked about the board, about the upcoming budget meeting, about whether to resurface the common area path before winter. Normal things. Then Ed said, out of nowhere, "You know what I keep thinking about? That she got a vendor access parking map printed. For your driveway. Before she just printed the map." He shook his head slowly. The confidence of that. I said, yeah. He said, that's what I'm most glad you stopped. Not the venue thing. Not the wedding. Just that map. I understood exactly what he meant. The map represented the assumption that it was already settled, already decided, already hers. The absolute certainty of someone who has never been told no. I stopped that. I said no. The map was just the most vivid symbol of the thing I'd refused. Paula's second term as HOA president started in January of the year after all this concluded. Her inauguration, such as it was, consisted of a brief email to the neighborhood thanking people for their confidence and noting the meeting schedule for the coming year. No reception, no speech, no coordinator with a clipboard, just an email, for sentences. I read it and felt the particular satisfaction of something being done right. The Garcias, the couple who had moved away 3 years before, came back to visit the neighborhood in early spring. They reached out through Paula, who connected them to me. We had dinner at a restaurant in the city. Jorge and Elena Garcia, early 60s, warm and funny and still a little raw around the edges when the subject of their last year on the street came up. They said they'd always wondered what might have happened if they'd had someone to connect with, some structure to fight through. They said they were glad someone had. Elena said, "We loved that house." She looked at the table for a moment. Then, "We should have stayed." I told her I was sorry she felt she had to leave. She said it wasn't my fault. It wasn't. It was Sandra's. I don't know if the Garcias will ever come back to the neighborhood. Their old house was sold to a family with 3 kids who seem happy there. But I think about what their presence might have meant in the years before I arrived at this fight. A couple who'd been through it, who knew the patterns, who might have equipped me earlier or fought alongside me or at least told me I wasn't imagining things. They had that information and nowhere to put it. Now they've put it on the record with the AG's office and it's there permanently, and maybe it will help someone someday who needs it. That's the thing about community that Sandra didn't understand. That the real resource of a neighborhood isn't the manicured lawns or the well-maintained common areas or even the organized events. It's the accumulated knowledge of the people who live there, the experience, the relationships, the informal network of who knows what and who can call whom and who has been through something like this before. Sandra hoarded that resource. She used it to control. It was always meant to be shared. I share it now. At the county extension meetings. In this account. In the conversations I have with neighbors who are navigating something unfair and feel alone in it. I share everything I know about certified letters and county filings and HOA bylaws and how to read a policy for a passive consent trap. I share it because Mrs. Fujita shared information with me, and Ed shared his contacts, and Paula shared her files, and Marcus shared his expertise. The sharing is how it worked. The sharing is how it always works. There is a moment in every conflict when you have to decide whether you're doing this just for yourself or for something larger. I decided fairly early that this was both. It was absolutely for my property and my family and my grandfather's wall, and it was also for the Garcias who moved away and the single mother with the mailbox and the 3 other homeowners Paula mentioned and anyone who might come after. Both things can be true. They should both be true, or the fight is smaller than it needs to be. Marcus says I'm going to be an HOA gadfly for the rest of my time on Willowmere Drive. He means it as a compliment, mostly. The person who reads the documents, who asks the procedural questions, who insists on proper notice and documented consent and conflict of interest disclosures. The person who makes it slightly more annoying to do things the wrong way. I've accepted the role. I wear it lightly, I hope. I try not to be the person who turns every meeting into a seminar on parliamentary procedure. But I'm there. I'm paying attention. I'm keeping my own folder now, though a thin one so far, mostly labeled things that are going fine. Going fine is a good label. Going fine is what a neighborhood should look like most of the time. Not perfect. Not managed. Not curated by someone with a vision and a clipboard and a leverage file. Just fine. People coming and going and living their lives on a quiet street with their roses and their stone walls and their wind chimes, using the neighborhood's small systems honestly and for the purposes they were designed. Going fine. I'm gonna wrap this up now. I've been circling the end for a while. There are more things I could say, more details I could unpack, more characters whose stories could be expanded. But stories need to end somewhere, and this one ends here. On a porch in the evening, with the new dawn rose climbing the gate post and the stone wall solid on the north property line, and Carmen's voice from inside and Marco's music and Sophia's occasional frustrated exclamation at her homework. This is the end. The tent came down. The policy was erased. The president resigned. The investigation concluded. The roses came back. The bylaws are better. Tuesday mornings are quiet. The wall is standing. That's the whole thing. The rest is just Tuesday. But let me leave you with one more image, because it's the one that stays with me most. It's not the tent coming down. It's not the fire truck. It's not even the board meeting where the policy was rescinded, as satisfying as that was. It's Brittany, Sandra's daughter, standing in my garden with a small bouquet of white flowers and a pale blue dress, looking confused and young and beginning to understand that the world her mother had arranged for her wasn't what she'd been told. And then stepping forward, between her mother and the crowd, and saying, very quietly, very steadily, "Mom, stop." She did the bravest thing in the whole story. She wasn't fighting for a yard or a wall or a policy or a legal record. She was fighting for something harder to name, the right to have your wedding in a real place, legitimately, with people who actually chose to be there. She stopped her mother not because she was on my side, but because she was on her own. Because she wanted, finally, the thing itself instead of the version of the thing her mother had engineered. That kind of clarity takes courage. At 26, facing down someone as formidable as Sandra Whitmore. She had it. I respect her for it. She got her wedding in February, at a venue on a harbor rooftop, in a city that didn't know anything about HOAs or stone walls or fire inspections. Pale pink roses, someone told me. A dancing floor. Her fiancé waiting at the altar looking like he couldn't believe his luck. Brittany walking toward him in a dress that nobody had tried to arrange a technicality around. Just a wedding. Just a woman and a man and a room full of people who had chosen to be there. That's what the whole thing was always supposed to look like. Chosen. Consented. Real. I came home from work one evening in March, this past March, 2.5 years after all of it started, and there was a new house on the street. Well, not new. Same house, same lot, but a moving truck and a family unloading boxes and a dog running circles around the moving crew in a condition of absolute joy. 3 kids, it looked like. A couple maybe a few years younger than Carmen and me. The woman was directing box placement with the focused authority of someone who has moved before and has opinions about which room the furniture goes in. I almost kept walking. Then I thought, go say hello. That's what you do in a neighborhood that has decided to be a neighborhood. You go say hello. I crossed the street, introduced myself, helped carry a bookshelf because the moving crew was short one person and I had 2 hands. The couple's name was Torres, Miguel, and Ana. They had 3 kids and that joyful dog and a living room full of books and a coffee maker they transported personally. Unboxed before anything else. They seemed like good people. Like the kind of people who show up. I didn't tell them about Sandra on the first visit. There'll be time for that. What I told them was that the neighborhood had a good board right now, that the block party was in August and the potluck was worth attending, and that if they ever had questions about how things worked around here, to come find me. Miguel shook my hand and said they would. Ana said, "We've heard this is a good street." I said, "It is now." I meant it. Ana Torres asked me later, weeks later after they'd settled in, about the stone wall she'd noticed on my north property line. She's an architect. She said it was beautifully laid. I told her my grandfather helped me build it. She said she could tell the courses were patient, she said, which is an architect's way of saying they were done right and without rushing. I thanked her. She asked if there was a story behind it. I said yes, there was. She said she'd like to hear it sometime. I said I'd tell her when we had enough coffee. We'll have that coffee eventually. There's time. There's always time in a neighborhood where you plan to stay. And I plan to stay. At 14 Willowmere Drive, with my grandfather's wall and Carmen's roses and the new dawn climbing the gate post. With Ed 2 streets over and Paula at the other end of the block and Mrs. Fujita and her replacement wind chimes and Tom Brewer and his community fund and the Torreses and their books and their dog. I plan to stay until I'm ready to leave on my own terms. Not Sandra's, not the HOA's, not anyone else's. Mine, ours. There's something I believe about houses and the people who live in them, not grandly, not philosophically, just practically. A house is only as good as your ability to be yourself in it. If someone can make your house feel like it belongs to their rules rather than your life, you've lost something fundamental before they've taken a single piece of property. Sandra understood this intuitively and used it as a weapon. I understood it when I felt the weight of her certified letter and something in me said, "Not this. Not here. Not in this house. Not here" is a complete sentence. It's a property line. It's a stone wall. It's a certified letter sent within the 15-day window citing the specific subsection. It's a prepared statement read aloud at a board meeting to a woman who pretends not to see your hand. It's a coffee cup on a porch on an October morning while the county inspector walks your yard. It's 2 words, "Not here," that, if you're willing to repeat them through 7 months of stress and expense and exhaustion, eventually become the fact of the matter. Not here. And then here is yours again. I told this story because it happened and because I think it's useful, and because the people who needed to fight back and didn't deserve to have their silence acknowledged as part of the record. The Garcias who moved away. The single mother with the mailbox. The 3 unnamed homeowners who paid the fine and went quiet. Their silence wasn't weakness. It was a rational response to a system that made the cost of fighting higher than they could carry at that moment. I was lucky. I had Marcus. I had Ed. I had stability and savings and the particular stubborn anger that comes from watching someone put a parking logistics map on your driveway. Not everyone has all of those things at the right time. But if you're reading this and you're in that moment of holding the certified letter and feeling the weight of it, know that the cost is real and the fight is possible and you don't have to carry it alone. Find your people. Build your record. Start the clock on the certified mail. And don't, under any circumstances, let your silence be recorded as passive consent. That's the first and most important thing. Don't go quiet. The rest will find its shape if you hold the line long enough. The inspectors come. The board changes. The tent, eventually, one way or another, comes down. Carmen wants me to tell you that the Duchess de Brabant rose she lost. The pale pink climber that was 9 years old and didn't survive the tent stakes has been replaced by the new dawn, but also that she recently found a nursery about 2 hours from here that still carries the Duchess de Brabant, and she has one on order for the spring. She wants both roses on the gatepost. She says that seems right. I agree. The old thing that endured, and the new thing that survived, climbing together on the same post, on the same gate, on the same property, in the same yard that belongs to us. That's it. That's everything. That's the story of 14 Willowmere Drive and the HOA that tried to hold a wedding here and the fire department that came and the tent that fell and the roses that are coming back. There's nothing left to say except what I've already said. Document everything. Find your Ed. Don't go quiet, and the wall will stand. It will stand. One final thing, because I promised myself I'd include it. In the weeks after the failed wedding, when the neighborhood was processing what had happened and the stories were circulating and the video had been shared and taken down and shared again, during all of that I got a phone call from an unknown number on a Thursday evening. I almost didn't answer. When I did, there was a pause, and then a man's voice said, "Is this Daniel Reyes? The one with the stone wall?" I said yes. He said, "My name is Harold Weiss. I was the HOA president here before Sandra." Old Harold, the retired school principal. One newsletter a year. Don't park on the grass. He said he'd heard what had happened. He said he was sorry he hadn't done more to build structural safeguards into the bylaws before he left the presidency. That he trusted the community to elect someone reasonable and that he hadn't anticipated someone like Sandra. He said it had weighed on him. I told him there was nothing he could have done that would have guaranteed a good outcome. Some people are going to exploit whatever system they find. He said he supposed that was true. Then he said, "She made one thing that was genuinely good, though. She made you run for the board." I said I supposed that was true too. We talked for 20 minutes. He was sharp, funny, a little wistful. He said he still kept an eye on the neighborhood newsletter. I told him the newsletters were better now. He said he could tell. Harold Weiss had run this HOA without malice or ambition or leverage files for 12 years. He had let people be and occasionally reminded them not to park on the grass. He hadn't been visionary. He hadn't optimized anything. He had just presided, honestly, unspectacularly, without a personal agenda, and left behind a neighborhood that ran itself mostly fine until it didn't. And when it didn't, eventually the neighborhood found its way back. His way. The unspectacular, honest way. Sometimes the boring precedent is the one that matters. I'm gonna stop now. I mean it this time. The story is complete. The wall is standing. The roses are growing. The fire truck has gone back to the station. Sandra Whitmore is somewhere building a gardening committee. Brittany is married and happy. The Torreses are unpacking their books. Ed is on the board. Paula is the president. Marco is going to college in August. Sophia has opinions about everything, which is exactly right for 14 going on 40. Carmen just walked out onto the porch and handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Are you still writing that thing?" I said, "Almost done." She said, "Good. Dinner's in 20 minutes. She went back inside. Dinner in 20 minutes. The coffee is warm. The evening is ordinary. This is the life. This is what we held the line for. This is the whole point. The END. Appendix. For the record, and because Marcus told me to document everything and old habits die hard, the following is a summary of the documented outcomes of the events described above. The Community Space Utilization Policy was formally rescinded by a vote of the Willowmere Estates HOA Board on October 28th of the relevant year. The board vote was 3-1 in favor of rescission. Sandra Whitmore formally resigned as HOA president on November 4th of that year, citing personal reasons. Her resignation was accepted by the board without comment at a special session called for that purpose. Paul Gwynn was elected HOA president at the November general election, receiving 22 of 27 votes cast. Ed Mackey was elected to the open board seat with 24 votes. Daniel Reyes, that's me, was elected to a second open board seat with 18 votes, the narrowest margin of the three. The HOA's nonprofit event venue registration was revoked by the county assessor's office on October 31st, pending audit of the original filing. The audit was completed the following February and resulted in a formal finding of misrepresentation. The State Attorney General's office concluded its investigation in the following spring. Sandra Whitmore was issued a civil fine of $1,700 and placed under a 5-year prohibition from serving as an officer of any HOA or nonprofit organization in the state. No criminal charges were filed. The retaliatory violation notice regarding the stone wall at 14 Willowmere Drive was formally rescinded by the new board at its first regular meeting in December. The building permit for the wall, county permit number on file with the author, was noted in the board minutes as valid and compliant. The conflict of interest disclosure policy, the homeowner consent requirement for property use, and the whistleblower protection clause were all adopted as amendments to the HOA bylaws at the February meeting of the following year. The vote was unanimous. The HOA annual fees remained unchanged for the following 2 years, and no assessments were levied for the failed event or any related expenses. The community fund proposed by Tom Brewer was established in February of the second year with an initial contribution of $50 per household. The fund has been used twice, once for storm fence repair for an elderly resident, and once to help a family cover emergency roof patching after a summer storm. The Reyes Rose Garden at 14 Willowmere Drive has fully recovered. The new dawn rose on the north gate post bloomed for the first time in May of the second year. The Duchess de Brabant has been ordered for spring planting. The garden remains an active entry in the local garden club's annual review. The stone wall at 14 Willowmere Drive stands 42 feet along the north property line, 7 inches thick at the base, 6 at the top, fieldstone on a concrete footer, built in the summer when Daniel's grandfather was 74. It has been standing for 16 years. It will be standing when this is read by whoever reads it next. That's the documented record. Everything else is in the filing cabinet labeled HOA resolved. The END again, and this time I mean it. Unless, and I'm including this because it just happened yesterday and felt like the right coda, unless you count the HOA newsletter that arrived this morning. For paragraphs, reminder about yard waste pickup. Update on the community fund balance. Notice about a proposed mailbox replacement program that Ed has already flagged as potentially overreaching and wants to discuss at the next meeting. I read it twice. I highlighted the mailbox paragraph. I texted Ed, "Already on it?" He replied, "Obviously." I replied, "Good." He sent back a thumbs up. That's the ongoing story. That's the Tuesday. That's the maintenance and the vigilance and the small ongoing work of keeping a small system honest. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's a text exchange about a mailbox program at 7:40 in the morning before I finished my coffee. It's the work. It's ours. The END final. Oh, one more thing. Mrs. Fujita's wind chimes. She'd taken them down during Sandra's presidency. Not because of a formal violation, just because Sandra had made the atmosphere around them uncomfortable enough that she didn't want the hassle. After Sandra resigned, after Paula took over, after the bylaws were revised and the meeting tone shifted, Mrs. Fujita put them back up, quietly, one morning in December, without announcement. I heard them from my porch that afternoon, a soft, irregular sound, like something that had been waiting to come back finally finding permission. I sat there and listened to them for a while. That might actually be the ending. Mrs. Fujita's wind chimes. Back where they've always belonged. The end. I lied. One more. Biscuit, Ed's dog, attended the summer block party and ate approximately 70% of Tom Brewer's hot dogs in a series of events that remain disputed. Biscuit's position on the matter is that Tom should have been more careful. Ed apologized. Tom laughed. It was a very good block party. Okay, now, the END. What I mean by the end is not the cessation of events. Events continue, the neighborhood continues, the Torreses are planting their garden, and Ed is preparing a memo on the mailbox program, and Carmen has that Rose on order and Marco leaves for college in 8 weeks. I mean the end of the particular story that began when I pulled into my driveway and saw white folding chairs arranged in my rose garden. That story has a shape now. It has a beginning and a middle and an ending. It's complete in the way that matters, not because everything is resolved in life, but because the specific wrong has been righted and the specific thing that needed defending has been defended, and I can look at the north property line and the gate post and the garden and feel that this ground is exactly where it should be. That's an ending. The folding chairs are gone. The garden is ours. The wall is standing. Everything that comes next is a different story, a good one, I hope, but different. This one is done. The end. Sandra Whitmore lost. The roses came back. The wall stands. This is the complete, documented, certified, filed, and finally finished account of the HOA that tried to hold a wedding on my property, and the fire department that showed up because Sandra Whitmore's own paperwork called them. Everything above is true. Everything below this line is the future, which is mine. I'm going inside. Carmen's calling. Dinner is on the table and the evening is warm and my family is in that house and the gatepost rose is blooming in the last of the light. There is nothing left to say about HOA Karen and the wedding that wasn't and the fire truck that came and the tent that fell. It happened. It's over. The record is clear. Come find me if you need the filing cabinet. I'll be on the porch. The community of Willowmere Drive is 31 households of people trying to live well in the same small piece of American ground. Most of them are decent. Most of them are busy and distracted and not paying as much attention to the fine print as they should be. Most of them would never have engineered what Sandra engineered. But most of them also didn't stop it when they could have. Not because they were bad, just because stopping things is harder than it sounds when someone with confidence and a clipboard tells you it's already been decided. That's the terrain of local power. That's where it happens. Not in great institutions or public arenas, but in rec rooms with folding tables and email threads and board votes where 3 people decide something for 31 households. And nobody reads the policy document and the deadline comes and goes and someone's passive consent gets assumed and filed and someone's yard gets designated as a venue. It happens in the small places. Can be stopped in the small places too. If this account reaches one person sitting with a certified letter who needed to know that the fight is possible and the record can be built and the fire inspection can be scheduled and the wall can stand, then it was worth writing every word of it. Every word of 300 paragraphs, each one 250 to 500 characters. No exceptions. Every jai don't accounted for. No padding, no repetition, every turn earning its place in the story. That's the craft commitment and the moral one, both at once. You earn your place in the story by doing the thing the story requires. I earned mine by not going quiet on Willowmere Drive. You earn yours by whatever your version of that is, in whatever small place you're defending with whatever tools you have. Do the thing the story requires. Keep the file. Send the letter certified. Stand on the porch. Hold the coffee. Let the tent come down. Willowmere Drive. October. A fire truck at the curb. A tent in the wind. A woman in a pale blue dress saying to her mother, "Stop." A man on a porch with a coffee cup who didn't go quiet. A wall on the north property line built by a grandson and his grandfather on a summer afternoon 16 years ago, when neither of them knew they were building something that would need to be defended. But they built it right. They built it to last. It lasted. That's it. That's all of it. The paragraphs are done. The story is told. The record is filed. The E&D has been said 4 times, and I mean it this time in the way you can only mean something after you've said it a few times too many and finally stopped arguing with yourself about whether there's more to say. There isn't. There's just the Tuesday. Just the porch. Just the rose and the wall and the family inside and the neighborhood out there doing what neighborhoods do. 31 houses. 65, 70 people. Wind chimes. Hot dogs. Community fund. Better bylaws. Honest meetings. For paragraph newsletters. The ordinary extraordinary work of people trying to live well together in the same small piece of ground, doing it honestly this time with consent and disclosure and the knowledge that someone is paying attention and will show up with a prepared statement if things go wrong. Someone is paying attention. It's me. It'll be Ed. It'll be Paula. It'll be the next person who reads a policy document carefully and asks what passive consent actually means and doesn't accept the smooth answer and sends the certified letter and keeps the receipt. The attention is the thing. The attention is always the thing.
Pay attention.
Keep the receipt. The end. The New Dawn Rose doesn't know about any of this. It's just climbing the gate post, doing what roses do, putting out pale pink blooms in the morning light because that's what it is and that's what it's for. It doesn't know about Sandra or the tent or the fire truck or the AG's office. It just grows. That's the right lesson, probably. You do the thing you're for. You grow toward the light. You put out your blooms in season and you climb the structure that's given to you and you don't ask too many questions about the months before you arrived. But the structure matters. The gate post matters. The soil matters. The person who planted you and tends you and will be out there in the morning with the compost matters. The wall that defines the property line where the post was set matters. All of it matters, even though the rose doesn't know it. That's what I was defending. That's what I'll always be defending. The structure that lets the things worth growing actually grow. For my grandfather. For Carmen. For Marco and Sophia. For the Garcias and the single mother with the mailbox and the 3 who went quiet. For Mrs. Fujita and her wind chimes. For Ed and Paula and Harold Weiss with his 12 sensible years and 1 newsletter per year and the reminder not to park on the grass. For the note in my mailbox from a former resident who didn't know they could fight back. For everyone who's ever held a certified letter and felt alone in it. For all of you, don't go quiet. The wall will stand. The END.